He was born on a world where it rained. This seems like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Water fell freely from the sky on Caladan, ran in rivers down from green mountains, pooled in harbours where his father's fishing fleet rocked at anchor in the morning fog. There was enough of it that no one counted it, weighed it, stored it behind locked doors, or wept genuine tears over its absence. Water was simply there. A background fact of existence, so constant that to the people of Caladan it had no more emotional weight than the air they breathed. It was what the world was. It was what the world had always been. Paul Atreides grew up knowing rain, and the fact that he grew up knowing rain matters more than almost anything else in his story, because everything that was about to happen to him would take place on a world where water was rarer than gold, more sacred than any prayer, more carefully guarded than any military secret. He was 15 years old when his world changed, and the first thing the new world asked of him was to forget everything he had ever taken for granted about the simplest substance in the universe. To understand Paul Atreides, you have to understand what he was carrying when he stepped off the transport onto the orange dust of Arrakis for the first time and breathed in that cinnamon strange air, and understood, in his body, before his mind could articulate it, that this was the place the dreams had been showing him. He was carrying a name that meant something. House Atreides was old. Its lineage ran back through the centuries of the British Imperium to the beginnings of the Landsraad, that great congress of noble houses whose complex web of obligation and rivalry had maintained, however imperfectly, the political architecture of a civilization spread across hundreds of worlds. The Atreides name did not mean what many great house names meant. It was not the name of a house that had clawed its way to prominence through the particular combination of wealth extraction and political manipulation that characterized so many of its peers. It meant something else, something rarer and therefore more dangerous. It was the name of a house that its people genuinely loved. Duke Leto Atreides governed Caladan the way a man governs when he has internalized the principle that power is a responsibility first and a privilege second, a principle that the Imperium's political culture had been slowly eroding for millennia. His soldiers were loyal because he treated them as though their lives were worth something. His people were loyal because his governance served them rather than extracting from them. And this loyalty, genuine, deep-rooted, the kind that follows a man into impossible situations because the people who offer it believe that the man is worth following, this loyalty was exactly what made House Atreides dangerous to Emperor Shaddam IV. The Emperor did not fear the Atreides name because of their armies. He feared it because of their reputation. An Atreides force was not simply a military unit. It was a collection of human beings who had chosen to be there, who continued to choose to be there every day, who would fight harder and more intelligently and with more genuine commitment than any force that had been assembled through conscription or fear or simple economics. The Emperor had Sardaukar, his legendary shock troops, the most feared soldiers in the known universe. But even the Sardaukar had limits that loyalty without love could not transcend. What Leto Atreides had built over years of just governance was something the Emperor's wealth could not buy, and his military could not replicate. And now the Emperor was sending the Atreides to Arrakis. This was the trap, elegantly constructed, plausibly deniable, the planet that produced melange, the spice that extended life, sharpened consciousness, allowed the guild navigators to fold space, and made the entire interstellar civilization possible, was being transferred from House Harkonnen to House Atreides. On paper, it was a reward. In practice, everyone sophisticated enough to read the political landscape understood it as a death sentence. The Harkonnens had held Arrakis for 80 years. 80 years of spice revenue, 80 years of learning the planet's logistical complexities, 80 years of building intelligence networks and military position, and the specific, deep knowledge of a hostile world that can only be acquired through presence and time. They were giving this up, not because they wanted to, but because they had been ordered to. And no one with any understanding of House Harkonnen believed for a moment that Baron Vladimir Harkonnen intended to simply walk away from the most profitable fief in the Imperium and wish the Atreides well. Paul knew all of this. He was 15, but he had been educated for this. Educated in ways that most 15-year-olds were not, could not be, because most 15-year-olds did not have a father who thought carefully about what knowledge a duke's heir would need to survive, and a mother whose training placed her among the most capable human beings alive. His mother, the Lady Jessica, was Bene Gesserit. This is a phrase that carries weight in every direction. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood had existed for thousands of years as one of the most quietly powerful institutions in the Imperium, a school, a religion, a breeding program, a political intelligence network, and a repository of accumulated human wisdom that operated almost entirely in the shadows, shaping events through influence rather than force. Maintaining a presence in every significant household in the Landsraad, not through conquest, but through the placement of trained sisters as wives and concubines and advisors to the powerful. Their training produced human beings of remarkable capability. The Prana Bindu disciplines, physical, physiological, and psychological techniques developed over millennia, gave Bene Gesserit adepts control over their own bodies that exceeded anything that unaugmented training could achieve. They could regulate their own heartbeats, alter their biochemistry in response to toxins, read the involuntary signals of other people's bodies with a precision that amounted to something very close to mind reading. They could use the voice, a technique of vocal modulation that exploited deep neural pathways to compel compliance in those who heard it. And the most fully realized among them, the Reverend Mothers, had access to other memory, the accumulated experiential record of their female ancestors stretching back through a genetic chain they could navigate like a library. Jessica had given her son as much of this as could be transmitted across the barrier of gender that limited some Bene Gesserit disciplines, and Leto had given Paul something different, the education of a mentat in training. The Butlerian Jihad, 10,000 years before Paul's birth, had prohibited thinking machines, computers, artificial intelligences, any device that could replicate the functions of the human mind. In the absence of such machines, humanity had developed human replacements, mentats, individuals trained from childhood in the disciplines of logical analysis that computers once provided. Paul was not a fully realized mentat. That was not the plan for him. But he had the training, the systematic analytical habits, the capacity for the kind of multivariable strategic assessment that allowed him to evaluate political situations with something approaching the precision of an instrument. He had the voice, partially he had the physical disciplines, he had the analytical training, he had the prescient dreams that had been coming to him for years now, vivid and specific and disturbing in ways he could not fully articulate. A blue-eyed girl in a desert landscape, himself standing at the center of something enormous and violent, the sense of paths branching and converging around a single point that was his own life. The Bene Gesserit had a word for someone with his specific combination of capabilities. They had been working toward producing this person for 90 generations. They had not expected him to arrive in this specific bloodline at this specific moment outside their control. The word was Kwisatz Haderach. It meant approximately the shortening of the way. It referred to a male who could access what even female Reverend Mothers could not just the female ancestral line in other memory, but the male line as well. Those dark places where the human capacity for violence and dominance and the will to power lived in the genetic record, the places that Reverend Mothers navigated around rather than through. A Kwisatz Haderach would be able to exist in the full range of human ancestral experience, male and female, light and dark, the accumulated record of everything the species had ever done, and been and become. Paul did not know this about himself. Not yet. The knowledge existed around him, but not fully in him, in Jessica's careful observations, in the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam's assessment, in the Bene Gesserit's records that he would never have direct access to. He knew his training, and he knew his dreams. He did not yet know what the dreams were. The Gom Jabbar test came before Arrakis. Mohiam arrived on Caladan with the Bene Gesserit's quiet authority and the specific weight that a woman carries when she is simultaneously a Reverend Mother, a king's truthsayer, and one of the most powerful political figures in the Imperium. She came to test Paul. She brought a metal box of invisible agony and a needle tipped with poison and a question that has no gentle version. Are you human? The test was brutal in its design. The box created pain, neurological pain of a purity and intensity that the body could not distinguish from actual physical damage, pain that arrived without injury and therefore without limit, pain that simply continued and continued. And the only variable was how long the person experiencing it chose to continue experiencing it rather than withdrawing their hand. The Gom Jabbar, the poison needle, waited at the neck. Pull the hand away, and the needle delivered what the name meant, the high-handed enemy, the death that came not from a fair fight, but from the failure to meet a standard. The standard was control. The standard was the ability to hold the mind in command of the body when the body's most urgent, most ancient, most deeply encoded message was run. The standard was, in the Bene Gesserit's formulation, the most basic distinction between the human and the animal. The animal acts on instinct. The human acts on choice. Paul passed. He sat in the box for what felt like an eternity of manufactured agony, and he did not move his hand. He passed, and he was furious, and he was shaking with the aftermath, and Mohiam watched him with a particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they have been waiting a long time to see, something they are not entirely certain they are glad to have confirmed. She said, "You've heard that humans mustn't try to replace animals with themselves. Now I want you to consider the seed." She was telling him something important. She was telling him that the Bene Gesserit did not conduct this test because they enjoyed watching children suffer. They conducted it because they had lived with the consequences across thousands of years of history of human beings who acted from instinct rather than choice, human beings who were, in their formulation, animals in human shape, capable of great intelligence directed toward the survival imperatives of the animal: acquire, dominate, reproduce, eliminate threats. The history of the Imperium was, in no small part, the history of what happened when such animals accumulated enough power to direct their instincts on a civilizational scale. The test was also, though Mohiam did not say this, a preliminary assessment. She was checking whether what she suspected about Paul was true. The results were consistent with what she suspected. She told Jessica that the boy might be the one. She told her this with the specific reluctance of a woman who understood what it would mean and was not sure whether meaning it was a gift or a sentence. Arrakis announced itself as heat before anything else. The ramp descended, and the air hit Paul like a wall. Not hot in the way that Caladan's summer afternoons were hot, with moisture in the warmth, but hot in the absolute way of a place that has never compromised with human comfort. A heat that came from a sun hanging lower and larger than Caladan's. A heat that the air carried without any of the softening qualities that humidity provides. It was honest heat. It was not interested in gradations. It simply was. The spice smell came with it. Cinnamon was the first note, familiar enough to be almost reassuring before the undertone arrived. Something older and stranger. Something that had no referent in any experience Paul had yet had. He would learn later that this was what the smell did to everyone who arrived on Arrakis for the first time. Gave them the familiar note first, let them think they knew what they were breathing, and then introduced the element that could not be mapped to anything else. The spice was already doing things to his perception, and he had not yet been formally introduced to it. The city of Arrakis spread out below the shield wall, the great geological formation that protected the northern polar basin from the full violence of Arrakis's Coriolis storms. The winds that built across thousands of kilometers of open desert and arrived at any obstacle with velocities that could strip flesh from bone. The shield wall had made Arrakis possible. Without it, the idea of a city on the surface of Arrakis was academic. With it, there was the grudging possibility of human habitation, provided the humans in question respected what the desert had to say about the terms. Arrakis was a city that respected the desert, not the way fear produces respect, the cringing respect of something that knows itself to be smaller than what it fears, but the practical respect of centuries of accommodation. The windscreens angled to deflect rather than block. The buildings designed to minimize exposure, to present the smallest possible face to the elements. The architecture that had been shaped not by aesthetic tradition or political symbolism, but by the specific demands of existing in an environment that would kill you if you gave it the opportunity. Paul read the city the way he had been trained to read things, as information about the people who had built it and the forces that had shaped them. What he read was a history of living with something that could not be defeated, only understood. The ducal residency was the former Harkonnen Palace, a building that told a different story. It was large and imposing and entirely designed for the demonstration of power rather than for the pragmatic management of survival. The Harkonnens had built it as a statement: we are not subject to this desert, the desert is subject to us. The desert had taken note of this statement and was waiting, with the patience that geological timescales make possible, for the opportunity to demonstrate its lack of interest in the Harkonnen position. Thufir Hawat was there, Duncan Idaho was there, Gurney Halleck was there. These were the men who had served House Atreides with a fidelity that the word loyalty undersells, because loyalty implies a calculation, a continuing choice to remain, and what these men offered was something that had moved past calculation into identity. They were Atreides in some essential sense that had nothing to do with blood. They had chosen the name and lived by what the name meant, and the choosing had changed them. Hawat was the mentat, master of assassins, in the organizational nomenclature which understated what he actually was. A mentat who had served the Atreides for most of his life, whose analytical intelligence was of the order that made the word brilliant feel inadequate. He was also old in the way of a person who has been doing difficult work at a high level for a very long time, and who carries in the lines of his face the accumulated evidence of everything the work had required. Idaho was the swordmaster. There are swordmasters in the Imperium who have the skill and lack the judgment. swordmasters who have the technical perfection of movement and have never had to apply it under conditions that actually mattered. Idaho was not this. He had earned his reputation the way reputations should be earned, in situations where the alternative to performing at the level he performed at was death, his own or the deaths of the people he was trying to protect. He was the finest personal combatant in House Atreides and had been sent ahead to Arrakis specifically to make contact with the Fremen, the desert people whose military capability the Harkonnens had catastrophically underestimated. Halleck was the troubadour soldier, the man who carried a balisette and played music and wrote verse and could in the same afternoon hold a defensive position against Harkonnen assault troops with the specific efficiency of someone who had done it before and understood precisely what was required. He had a grudge against the Harkonnens that went back to the slave pits of Gede Prime, where his sister had died and his body had been marked with the kind of marks that don't entirely disappear. He served the Duke with the intensity of a man who has found, in that service, something worth serving that isn't simply hatred of what destroyed his family. Paul watched these men move through the residency and absorbed the education they offered without a lesson being formally given. He had grown up watching how people who were actually competent at difficult things behaved, and the education in competence is always available if you are paying the right quality of attention. His father was dying. Not yet, not in any obvious way. Leto Atreides was still fully present, still governing, still making the decisions that a duke makes when he has just been handed the most valuable and most dangerous fief in the Imperium. He was meeting with Harhat and evaluating the intelligence about Harkonnen stay-behinds and assessing the viability of a Fremen alliance and running the calculations that a man in his position had to run simultaneously while also presenting the face of calm authority that the situation required him to present. But he was dying in the sense that anyone is dying who has fully understood their situation and accepted it without pretending it is something other than what it is. He told Paul that the thing they had most to fear was a certain type of Emperor's man. He told him that ultimate power made poor decisions in its own interest, and that the Emperor had made one here, and that they would find their way through it, or they would not. He said this without desperation, without the emotional colouring that a lesser man might have brought to the same analysis. He said it the way you say things when you have decided to be honest, because honesty is the only form of respect you can offer someone you love who is standing next to you in genuine danger. Paul received this. He had always been the inheritor of his father's particular way of looking at the world, not naively, not with the comfortable softness of someone who had never had to look directly at hard things, but with the specific quality of open-eyed honesty that was the Atreides tradition at its best. He received it, and he held it, and he felt the weight of it, and he went forward into the days that followed carrying what his father had given him. There was a Fremen woman among the household staff. Her name was Shadout Mapes, and she carried with her the blue within blue eyes that distinguished the Fremen, total spice saturation, the whites of the eye consumed by indigo. The iris deepened past its natural colour into something that had no name in the colour vocabulary of waterworlds. It was the mark of a people who had been saturated with spice from birth, who had breathed and eaten and absorbed melange every day of their lives in concentrations that visitors to Arrakis would accumulate only slowly, the mark of a life lived inside the planet's chemistry rather than passing through it. Jessica, observing her, used the formulas the Missionaria Protectiva had installed. The Missionaria Protectiva was the Bene Gesserit arm that seeded prophecies and religious frameworks into the cultures of primitive worlds, insurance policies for any sister who might find herself stranded among such peoples, a prepared reception. A mythological infrastructure that could be activated by the right words in the right context. The Fremen had been seeded with such infrastructure long ago by sisters who understood that Arrakis and its desert people were too strategically important to be left without Bene Gesserit preparation. Jessica spoke the words and watched Mapes recognize them. And then Mupez gave Jessica the Krisk knife, the Fremen blade, made from a sandworm's crystallized tooth, sacred, not to be shown to outsiders, offered in the gesture that the prophecy had prepared the Fremen to offer when the right person arrived. A test becoming a gift. Jessica received it with the understanding of what it meant, that she had passed something, had been recognized as something, had activated the Missionaria Protectiva's ancient infrastructure in exactly the way it had been designed to be activated. Paul watched all of this and filed it away with the other observations that were building, in his mentat training, into something approaching a model of the place he had arrived in. What was Arrakis? He was assembling the answer from 100 observations, the architecture, the behavior of the staff, his mother's conversation with Mapes, the quality of attention in every Fremen eye he had encountered since landing, the cinnamon taste in the air, the prescient dreams that were intensifying now that he was on the planet they depicted. Liet Kynes came, the imperial planetologist who was secretly the Fremen's ecological prophet, the man who had inherited his father Pardot Kynes's great vision for transforming Arrakis, who had spent his life developing and advancing the long-term plan to make the desert bloom. He was the bridge between the worlds, the off-world scientist whose credentials gave him access to imperial administrative circles, and the deep desert man who rode worms and commanded the loyalty of millions of people the Imperium didn't know existed. He took Paul to see a spice mining operation. It was a lesson in what Arrakis was, presented through what Arrakis produced. The factory crawler, vast and expensive and entirely purposeful, processing the surface sand where the spice blow had occurred, extracting the melange before the worms arrived. The carriole above it, ready to lift the entire harvester if the worm sign appeared too soon. The spice itself, orange rust in the sunlight, releasing that cinnamon strange smell in concentrated waves, and then the worm sign. The thumping in the sand that meant something enormous was coming, the surface disturbance that preceded the emergence of one of the creatures that the Fremen called Shai Hulud, the maker, the basis of their faith, the source of the spice, the apex predator of an ecology that had produced one of the most consequential substances in the known universe. The harvester extraction, the carriole's rescue operation, the narrow escape of the ground crew who had been working too far from the pickup point. Paul watched the worm arrive and swallow a piece of equipment the size of a large building, as though it were nothing significant. He watched it and understood what it meant for the desert to have a god, and what it meant for that god to be real. Kynes was watching Paul watch the worm. He was performing the assessment of a man who had spent years trying to read what various off-worlders would do with what Arrakis was, whether they would see the desert as an obstacle or a resource or something else entirely, whether the Atreides would be different from the Harkonnens in the ways that Arrakis needed them to be different. What he saw, watching the Duke's son observe the worm, suggested that the assessment was still open. The attack came at night, as the best attacks always do. Wellington Yue, a Suk doctor trained under the conditioning that was supposed to make treachery physiologically impossible, the imperial conditioning, the Suk school's guarantee, the thing that allowed the noble houses to trust their physicians with the intimate access that medical care required. The conditioning was supposed to be absolute, It was not absolute. The Baron Harkonnen had found the crack in it, because the Baron was the kind of man who looked for cracks in things that were supposed to be uncrackable, who applied his considerable intelligence to the specific project of finding the one thing that each person would break for. For Yue, it was his wife. She had been taken. The Baron had her, had been doing things to her, had maintained over years the precise balance of torture and hope that keeps a person both suffering and compliant, the torture demonstrating that the threat was real, the maintained life demonstrating that cooperation still had something to offer. Yue had broken. He had broken knowing he was breaking, knowing what it meant, knowing that there was no version of what he was about to do that he could reconcile with who he was, knowing that the man who emerged on the other side of the act would not be the man he had been before it. He disabled the shields, he allowed the Sardaukar in, the Emperor's troops wearing Harkonnen colours, the cleanest deniability the Emperor could construct, the fiction that this was a Harkonnen operation, and the Carino throne was not involved. He took Leto. He placed the weapon in Leto's tooth, because this was the last thing Yue could give him. A chance, small and probably insufficient, to take the Baron with him, a poisoned needle in a false tooth. The Duke would be taken to the Baron, and the Duke would bite down, and the gas would kill everyone in the room. The gas did not kill the Baron. He had survived it, barely, carried out while still breathing, scarred by the experience, but alive. Alive to feel the satisfaction of a plan coming together after years of work, alive to enjoy the thing that the Baron enjoyed more than almost anything else, the defeat of an enemy who had been too good to be defeated by ordinary means. Paul and Jessica had been taken too. This was part of the plan, not to kill them immediately, but to take them into the desert, deposit them in the sand, let the desert do the killing. Cleaner, deniable, simply two more people who had not survived Arrakis' hostile environment. Yue left them a way out. He could not save them, and he could not undo what he had done, but he could leave them the personal ornithopter, the coordinates, the equipment that a person who knew the desert might be able to use to survive. Whether this was the final act of a man trying to preserve some fragment of who he had been before the breaking, or simply the reflex of a doctor who could not entirely stop trying to minimize harm, is not a question that has a clean answer. Yue himself was killed shortly afterward, before he could know whether his wife was alive or dead, or whether the Baron had ever intended to honor the promise the Baron had never actually made. The desert received Paul and Jessica the way it received everything, without sentiment, without accommodation, with the absolute and impersonal hostility of an environment that had been optimizing for the elimination of the unprepared for millions of years. The still suits Yue had provided helped. The training Jessica had given Paul helped. The prescient dreams that had been showing Paul this landscape since before he arrived on the planet helped, in the specific way that knowing a place before you arrive in it gives you a kind of orientation that pure arrival cannot provide. Paul was 15 years old. He had just lost everything. His father, his home, the household that had been the context of his entire life, the specific arrangement of people and relationships and responsibilities that had constituted the world he lived in. He was in a desert that would kill him if he made the wrong decisions, running from soldiers who would kill him if they found him, moving through a landscape that looked, in his waking hours, exactly like the landscape of dreams that had been coming to him for years. He was also, though he could not have fully articulated it, beginning. The desert was not what the readings had described. The texts Paul had studied on Caladan, the ecological surveys, the imperial reports, the xenobiological assessments, the traders' accounts, had described Arrakis in terms that were accurate as far as they went and profoundly inadequate in the ways that matter. They described temperature ranges and atmospheric composition and the mechanics of spice production and the basic biology of the maker. The sandworm, the creature that the Fremen called Shai Hulud. What they could not describe was the quality of existing inside the desert, rather than reading about it. The scale was part of it. The dunes were not hills. They were not landforms in the sense that any other landscape used the word. They were massive in the way that geological forces are massive when they have been working with no opposition for millions of years. When wind and sand and time have built something that can only be called enormous, if you are willing to use the word in its most uncompromising sense. Crossing them was not a physical challenge in the way that climbing a mountain is a physical challenge. It was an immersion in a different relationship with space and distance, a relationship in which the ordinary measures of human experience, how far can I walk in an hour, how far can I see, how much territory can I cover before I need to rest, were systematically incorrect. The silence was part of it. A desert silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of wind and the presence of sand moving in wind and the presence, always, of the knowledge that somewhere beneath the surface something enormous might be moving, might be orienting toward you, might be responding to the vibration your footsteps are creating in the substrate. The silence held attention rather than releasing it. The cold was part of it. The desert's nights were not simply cooler than the days. They were a different climate, a different world, the same landscape transformed by the removal of the sun into something that had its own rules and its own demands. The stillsuit's insulation was essential. Without it, the desert's night was not uncomfortable. It was fatal. Paul and Jessica moved through it, using the desert walk, the shuffling, arrhythmic gait that the Fremen had developed across generations of survival necessity. The motion that sent no regular pulse into the sand, that created no pattern for a worm to track. They had learned the theory. They were learning the practice. The difference between knowing how to do something and being able to do it under the specific conditions that make it necessary is a difference that can only be closed by doing it. The dreams intensified. On the planet that the dreams had shown him, with the sand beneath his feet and the spice in the air working on his biochemistry in ways he had not yet begun to understand. The visions arrived with a clarity and a force that they had never had on Caladan. He saw futures. Not one future, a branching space of possibilities, each path leading to different outcomes, some catastrophic, some merely difficult, some carrying the specific quality that he had learned to recognize as the vision's signal for something important. A convergence, a place where the branches met, a point at which what he chose would determine what was possible afterward. Most of what he saw was fire. The jihad, that was the word that arrived with the fire, the word the Fremen used for the concept, was there in the probability space like a geological formation, massive and old and apparently inevitable. Billions of deaths. Worlds burning. The Fremen armies moving through the universe in his name, under his banner, fulfilling a prophecy that the Bene Gesserit had planted in their culture, and that was on the verge of coming true in ways the Bene Gesserit had not entirely planned for. He tried to find the path that avoided it. Every prescient consciousness eventually encounters the specific frustration of the vision's most fundamental feature. The future is not fixed, but the range of futures available in any given moment is constrained by what has already happened, and what had already happened was the convergence of forces, his own genetics. The Bene Gesserit's breeding program, the Fremen's manufactured faith, the specific explosive pressure of a people who had been oppressed for too long in a desert that had made them into the most effective fighters in the known universe, that was already, in some sense, done. He could choose which path through the fire he took. He could not find a path that had no fire. This was the first real lesson Arrakis taught him, the lesson that the desert gave anyone who stayed in it long enough to listen, Some things cannot be avoided, they can only be met. The Fremen found them, or they found the Fremen. The distinction matters less than it seems. In the open desert, the Fremen were always present and always invisible, the thousands-year-old ecology of a people who had learned to exist in the harshest environment on any inhabited world by becoming, insofar as human beings can, part of the environment itself. Their sandwalk left no tracks. Their still suits trapped their body moisture and their body heat. Their movements through the desert were as close to invisible as human beings could achieve through sustained cultural refinement across generations of survival selection. Stilgar found them. Naib of Sietch Tabr, leader of one of the great desert communities, a man who had earned his position through exactly the combination of demonstrated capability and the specific trust that only comes from having kept people alive in conditions designed to kill them for long enough that your judgment was no longer in question. He was not a romantic figure in the way that the Bene Gesserit prophecies encouraged the Fremen to expect their saviour to appear. He was a practical figure, direct, unsentimental, evaluating what stood before him with the efficiency of someone who made consequential decisions in time frames that did not permit extended reflection. He evaluated Paul and Jessica with the attentiveness of a man who understood that the desert had just delivered something unexpected, and that unexpected things in the desert were, until demonstrated otherwise, potential threats. He saw a Bene Gesserit witch. He knew the signs. Every Fremen Naib knew the signs, and a boy with something in his eyes that the signs had also prepared him to recognize, or to consider recognizing, or at least to not immediately dismiss. The test came, as tests always came among the Fremen, in the form of a confrontation that was both political and personal, a challenge that the community's structure required in order to process the arrival of outsiders. A moment at which the question of who Paul and Jessica were would be answered not by words, but by what they actually did when what they did mattered. Jamis challenged Paul. This is the moment that the Fremen tradition required. A challenge to the right of the off-worlders to join the Sietch community, answered in the only way the desert's logic permitted, through single combat with the Kryze knife to the death. It was not cruelty. It was epistemology. The desert had no use for credentials or recommendations or the social machinery of off-world politics. It had use for one thing, whether you could do what the situation required. The challenge was how the desert asked the question. Paul killed Jamis. He killed him with the specific efficiency of someone who had been trained in the most advanced personal combat disciplines available in the Imperium, who had been practicing since childhood, who had the physical capability and the technical knowledge that made the outcome, in retrospect, difficult to imagine being otherwise. He killed him, and he wept. This was the thing that the Fremen did not expect and could not entirely explain. Paul wept over the man he had just killed. Not performance, actual tears, actual grief, actual expenditure of the body's water over someone he had not known, someone who had been trying to kill him, someone whose death was now on Paul's hands in the specific way that the first killing always is on a person's hands. The Fremen watched him cry, and they watched him with the water running down his face, and they gave him names that carried the weight of who they understood him to be in the framework their faith had given them for understanding exactly this moment. Usul, the base of the pillar, his secret name, the name that would belong to the Sietch, the name that was his in the community that would now be his community. Muad'Dib, the desert mouse, the kangaroo mouse of Arrakis, the small creature that survived the harshest conditions through perfect adaptation, that was revered among the Fremen, not for its size or its power, but for its specific genius for being exactly what the desert required it to be. The name Paul chose for himself, knowing what he was choosing, knowing what it meant to claim the name of the creature that belonged to Arrakis the way no off-worlder could truly belong. The creature that the second moon of Arrakis showed in pattern on its surface. He was Fremen now, or the beginning of Fremen. The becoming would take time. It would require learning things that could not be learned quickly. Not the academic knowledge of desert ecology or the technical information about sandworms and spice production, but the embodied knowledge, the knowledge that lives in the muscles and the reflexes and the instincts, the knowledge that only comes from being inside the desert long enough for the desert to finish writing itself into your body. Chani was the girl from the dreams. He had seen her before he arrived on Arrakis, in the prescient visions that had been coming to him for years on Caladan, the blue-eyed girl whose face arrived with a quality of significance that the visions attached to things that genuinely mattered. She was Liet Kynes' daughter, the daughter of the man who was secretly the most important Fremen leader in a generation. The man whose ecological vision was the hidden project that the desert was slowly being transformed by. She was also, in herself, everything the desert produced when it took human material and refined it over years of the specific demands that surviving in the most hostile inhabited environment in the known universe required. She was also simply herself. This is the thing about Chani that the mythology surrounding Paul always risks obscuring. She was not a symbol before she was a person. She was a Fremen woman who had grown up in the desert, who had fought and survived and become capable in ways that had nothing to do with anyone's prophecy, who had her own understanding of what the desert was and what it asked of the people who lived in it and what it meant to be Fremen. She looked at Paul and she assessed him with the eyes of someone who had no interest in mythology and every interest in whether this specific person was capable of what the desert required. He was, as it turned out. Not yet, not in those first months, not in the early weeks of learning the sandwalk at an adult age when the learning should have been done in childhood. Learning the stillsuit disciplines, learning what the desert asked of the body every moment that you existed inside it. But he was learning at a rate that the Fremen found surprising, learning the way someone learns when they bring to the process both genuine intelligence and genuine humility. When the pride that usually interferes with instruction has been replaced by the recognition that the lesson is actual survival and the teacher knows things you do not know, and pretending otherwise is a way to die. Jessica underwent the Water of Life ordeal, the Bene Gesserit rite that she had been trained for, but had never performed under conditions that the training had anticipated. She drank the exhalation of a drowned sandworm, the most toxic liquid in the known universe, and transformed it. This is what Reverend Mothers could do. Take the Water of Life and change it from within, convert the lethal into something the body could process, emerge on the other side of the ordeal as something fundamentally different from what they had been before it. What she became was the Sietch's Reverend Mother, the spiritual and memory authority of the community, the woman who carried other memory in its full depth, the bridge between the ancestral past and the living present. The child she had been carrying survived this. Aaliyah, born with other memory already active, the pre-born condition that the Bene Gesserit considered the most dangerous possible outcome of the ordeal, the condition that produced what they called an abomination. A consciousness exposed to the full weight of ancestral lives before the individual self had developed the architecture to contain them, before the ego had formed strongly enough to maintain its center against the pressure of all the other selves pressing in from the ancestral record. Elia was born ancient and small and already carrying more than any single consciousness should be required to carry. Paul watched his sister be born and understood in the way that a Kwisatz Haderach, in the process of becoming a Kwisatz Haderach, understands things, that she was something no one had terms for yet, and that the terms they would eventually develop would not be kind. The stillsuit had been on his body for months now. The blue had come into his eyes, the Fremen blue, the spice saturation, the body's visible record of how thoroughly the planet had accepted him into its chemistry. He had ridden sandworms. He had learned to call them, to mount them with maker hooks, to stand on the back of a creature 100 meters long, moving at 60 kilometers an hour through the dune sea, and to direct it as the Fremen directed their makers, with the precision of people for whom this was not a feat, but simply how you moved across the desert when distance required it. Worm riding was the most complete way Paul had found to understand what it meant to inhabit Arrakis rather than simply survive on it. The worm was not a vehicle, it was a living thing of enormous age and incomprehensible scale, moving through the sand in the specific way that the desert's god moved, and to stand on its back was to be in contact with the most fundamental force on the planet. The force that produced the spice, that maintained the ecology, that had been shaping this world since long before any human being had ever set foot on it. Riding it required you to be exactly present, completely attentive, completely responsive, completely inside what was happening rather than observing it from any comfortable distance. He was dreaming more clearly now. Or rather, the dreams had become less like dreams and more like perception, less like the sleep visions that blur at the edges and fade with waking, more like a faculty, an additional sense that operated alongside the ordinary ones and provided information about a different domain. He could see the probabilities gathering around decisions he had not yet made. He could feel the weight of certain choices, the way some paths through the probability space were worn grooves that everything inclined toward, and other paths were narrow and difficult and required effort to stay on. The war against the Harkonnens intensified. The Fremen were not simply desert people, they were fighters of the highest order, shaped by an environment that had been selecting for survival capability for thousands of years, animated by a faith that told them they were doing the work of God, carrying a technological and tactical advantage that the Harkonnens had consistently underestimated, because underestimating the Fremen was what you did when you had not paid the price of underestimating them. Paul brought to this war the Bene Gesserit combat disciplines, the weirding way techniques that translated the prana bindu mastery of the body into combat applications that exceeded what conventional training could produce, that moved with a speed and precision that looked from outside like something more than human, that gave the Fremen fighters capabilities they had not had before Paul arrived. To train them, he also brought the prescient faculty, growing more reliable and more acute as the spice saturation deepened, as the dreams became less like dreams, as the vision clarified. He was becoming the thing the prophecy had described, not because the prophecy had described it and he was fulfilling it, although there were those around him who understood it in exactly that way, but because the specific combination of what he was, what the desert was doing to him, and what the situation was requiring of him, was producing a convergence that the Bene Gesserit had been working toward for 90 generations, and had partially achieved and partially simply pointed in the direction of, without knowing exactly what it would look like when it arrived. The thing it would look like, Paul was beginning to understand, was not what anyone had imagined. He drank the water of life. He should not have survived it. Men did not drink the water of life. This was not custom or tradition or prejudice. It was the observed reality of what happened when male consciousness encountered the ordeal that female reverend mothers survived through specific physiological and psychological capabilities that had been developed, refined, and culturally transmitted over millennia. Men who encountered the water of life died. This was not a rule that had exceptions. It was a rule that had no exceptions until Paul Atreides drank it and did not die, but lay for 3 weeks in a coma while his consciousness underwent the transformation that the water of life initiated. He lay in the Sayach and did not wake. Chani stayed. Jessica stayed. The Sayach waited with the patience of people who understood that waiting was often the most productive thing available. What happened to Paul's consciousness during those 3 weeks is not something that can be fully articulated in terms that outside experience provides the vocabulary for. The prescient faculty that had been developing since his arrival on Arrakis expanded, not quantitatively, not simply as more of the same vision he had been having, but qualitatively into a different kind of perception. He gained access to the male ancestral lines in other memory, the dark places that reverend mothers navigated around, the places where the species' capacity for violence and dominance and the will to power existed in the genetic record alongside everything else. He could hold the full range of human ancestral experience, not as information, but as accessible consciousness. As present realities he could enter and leave, rather than simply records he could consult. He woke and he knew the future in a way that he had not known it before. Not everything, not certainty. The vision was not of a fixed future, but of the probability space. And the probability space remained what it had always been, a landscape of more and less likely outcomes, of paths that were deeply grooved, and paths that were narrow and barely possible. But the clarity was new, and the depth was new, and the specific emotional weight of what he saw was new, in a way that the dreams on Caladan had not prepared him for. He saw the jihad. He saw it more completely than he had ever seen it before, not as a vague catastrophe at the edge of the vision, but as a specific reality, a documented thing. A thing he could see in its details. Worlds burning, populations displaced or destroyed. The Fremen moving through the universe in his name with a specific violence of people for whom religious faith and military capability had merged into something that had no natural upper limit. Billions of deaths. Not thousands, not millions. Billions. The conservative estimate was 61 billion. He held this number, and he understood what it meant, which is to say he understood it as people never truly understand statistics and abstract numbers, but almost always understand specific human deaths. He understood it as loss, as a thing that was going to happen, or was already happening in the probability space, a thing he was at the center of. He saw no path around it. He saw paths through it that were more and less catastrophic, paths that led to outcomes that were better and worse on the far side of the fire, but no path that avoided it entirely. The jihad was what happened when the Fremen's faith was combined with their military capability and his own existence as the figure the faith had always been pointing toward. He was the catalyst. He was not the cause. The Bene Gesserit's manufacturing of the prophecy was the cause, and the Harkonnens' brutal governance that had turned the Fremen into the most dangerous fighting force in the universe was the cause, and the specific political arrangements of the Imperium that had made all of this possible were the cause. But he was the catalyst, and the catalyst cannot be removed from the reaction without the reaction not occurring. He chose, not with happiness, not with the serene acceptance that the mythology later assigned to this moment. He chose with the specific quality of a decision made by someone who has looked at every alternative and found that all of them are worse than the thing they are choosing. Who makes the choice anyway, because not choosing is also a choice and its consequences are worse. Who carries forward knowing what is coming and what it will cost him specifically to be the person who made it happen. He chose to be what the vision showed him and to try to shape what he was within the constraints that the probability space permitted. The battle for Arrakis arrived with a Coriolis storm. Emperor Shaddam IV had come personally. This was the ultimate statement of imperial authority. The Padishah Emperor, master of the known universe, the Corino throne that had ruled for 10,000 years, present in person with Sardaukar legions to settle the question that the political machinations had failed to settle. To demonstrate that what the Emperor wanted was not ultimately negotiable. He had brought everything that the demonstration of imperial power required. He was going to make an example. Paul atomized the shield wall. Not metaphorically, he used the family atomics, the weapons that the Great Convention technically prohibited against human beings, but that had always been read by sharp legal minds as not prohibiting against terrain. He used them against the mountain range that sheltered the northern basin from the full violence of the planet's weather. He created a gap, and through the gap came the Coriolis storm that had been building across the open desert, and through the storm came the Fremen armies, and with the Fremen armies came the sandworms. Worm cavalry. This phrase does not fully communicate what it meant in practice. A sandworm 100 meters long, moving at 60 kilometers an hour, responding to the direction of the Fremen rider on its back. Arriving out of a storm that had already disrupted every piece of imperial technology calibrated for normal atmospheric conditions. Arriving at the imperial encampment that had been positioned because imperial encampments were positioned for conventional warfare, which this was not, in the worst possible location to survive the combination of storm and desert creature of that scale. The Sardaukar were the finest soldiers the Imperium had ever produced. They were not soldiers who had trained to face what was coming. The battle was not long. There are battles that are not long because one side is more powerful, and there are battles that are not long because the more powerful side achieves its decisive advantage before the less powerful side can recover its footing. And this was the second kind. The Emperor's forces were numerically superior and technologically sophisticated and composed of men who had earned their position through exactly the brutal selection process that Seleucus Secundus imposed on the people who survived it. None of this was sufficient against the combination of terrain and conviction and tactical surprise that the Fremen forces had assembled. Paul found the Emperor. There was a moment in this encounter that was not military and not political, but was instead the confrontation between two very different understandings of what power was and what it was for. Shaddam Corino had governed through the specific combination of inherited authority and the threat of force that the Corino line had maintained for 10,000 years. He had never needed to be a great man because the structures he had inherited were sufficient to accomplish what power required without greatness. Paul Atreides, barely 17 years old, the Duke's son who had spent 2 years learning what a desert required, was the specific product of the Atreides tradition of governance, the tradition that had created loyalty rather than compliance, that had treated the governed as real, that had understood that the foundation of durable power was not the threat of force, but the genuine alignment of interest between those who governed and those who were governed. The Emperor capitulated. Not because he had no choice. He always had choices. Men in his position always had choices. but because the choices available to him had been reduced, through the battle's outcome, to options that differed only in how badly they ended for him. Paul demanded the Emperor's daughter Irulan as wife, not from love, which was irrelevant to the political calculation, but to establish the legitimacy of a new order through connection to the old one, to give the transition the Correno blood that the Landsraad expected any governing house to have. He demanded acknowledgement of his right to Arrakis and to the spice revenue and to the political standing that Arrakis's control provided. He got it. He got it because he held the thing that no one in the negotiation could afford to lose: the spice. The guild needed it. The Bene Gesserit needed it. The Imperium's medical establishment needed it. The noble houses whose members had extended their lives through decades of spice use needed it. Everyone in the known universe who had organized their existence around the assumption that melange would be available needed it, and Paul held it, and the threat of destroying the spice fields rather than allowing them to return to control he did not exercise was not a bluff. Chani was there. She watched the political theatre of Paul's marriage to Irulan with the specific quality of understanding that a person from the desert brings to the performances of power, the ability to see through to the function, to evaluate what the ceremony actually was rather than what it claimed to be. She knew that Irulan was a political necessity, a name on a document, a Correno princess who would provide Paul with legitimacy and would provide Chani with the specific dignity of being the person Paul actually chose while Irulan received the title. She accepted this. She accepted it because she was Fremen, and the Fremen had been making pragmatic accommodations with the demands of survival since long before any of the current political arrangements had existed. Paul was emperor. He was Muad'Dib. He was the Kwisatz Haderach. He was the figure the prophecy had promised and the jihad had begun. He was also, still, in whatever private space remained after all of these identities had been inscribed over him, himself, the 15-year-old boy who had come down the ramp into the Arrakeen heat and breathed the cinnamon air. The person Chani had taught the desert walk to in the early months when he was still learning the body knowledge that Fremen children received from birth. The son of Leto Atreides, who had watched his father die, for the principle that power was a responsibility before it was a privilege, and who had carried that principle into the desert and built it into the foundation of something that was now going to remake the known universe. Whether it was going to remake it well was a different question, and it was a question the vision was already providing answers to that Paul was not yet fully ready to sit with. The years of the jihad passed like something between a dream and a nightmare. To speak of the jihad as it happened to those who lived through it, on the worlds it reached and the populations it encountered, is to speak of what the historians would later call the most violent period since the Butlerian Jihad 10,000 years before. The numbers are almost too large to absorb. 61 billion dead, 90 planets effectively sterilized, 500 worlds with significant populations permanently disrupted. These are the conservative figures, the ones that the official records acknowledged. The actual figures are what always remains after the official records are set aside, larger, more complete, more terrible, harder to look at directly. Paul knew this was happening. He had seen it in the visions before it occurred, had seen it with the specific clarity of prescient perception, had understood what it meant, and had chosen to move forward through it rather than to seek a path around it that would have led somewhere he was not willing to go. The people who later criticized this choice, and many did, do, and will, are arguing with the terms of the choice rather than its logic, which is a form of argument that is always available but never quite reaches the actual decision point, the specific moment at which a person stands in the middle of a probability space and makes the best available choice among options that are all, in some significant way, bad. His court was on Arrakis. He governed from the planet that had made him on the terms that the desert had established. Irulan was his official consort and the author of the historical records that would shape how future generations understood his life, a role she performed with the intelligence and commitment of a woman who had found, in documentation and analysis, the specific form of participation available to her in arrangements that had not been made for her benefit. She was not his partner in the sense that Chani was his partner. She was the official witness, the record keeper, the person who transformed events into narrative, and this was not nothing. The narrative was, in some ways, what would last. Chani was alive. This was the central fact of Paul's personal existence during the jihad years, the ground against which everything else was measured. She was Fremen in a court that was becoming less Fremen with each year, as the political necessities of governing an interstellar empire required accommodations with forms and protocols and the social machinery of power that had nothing to do with the desert. She watched this process with the specific alertness of a person who understands what is being traded and is not certain the trade is worth making. She was also trying to conceive. This detail, which the official histories treated as a dynastic concern, the production of an heir to the Atreides line, was something else to Paul and Chani. It was personal, and the personal did not stop being personal simply because everything around it had become political. She wanted their child. He wanted the child she wanted to give him. This desire existed alongside the prescient knowledge that he was developing about what that child's life would look like, knowledge that the visions were beginning to supply with a clarity that he was not certain he wanted. The conspiracies gathered. There is a specific quality to the conspiracies that form around very powerful people. The particular configuration of resentment and ambition and fear and genuine political disagreement that assembles itself whenever a single figure has accumulated enough power that their continued existence has become the primary obstacle to every other person's ambitions. Paul was the target of multiple overlapping conspiracy structures that were not coordinated with each other, that were in some cases working toward contradictory goals, that shared only the common denominator of wanting Paul's power to decrease or end. The Bene Gesserit had not forgiven him for arriving ahead of schedule, outside their control, and declining to be managed. The Guild resented a prescient emperor whose vision could navigate the paths that Guild navigators had monopolized, whose existence threatened their navigational monopoly by demonstrating that the monopoly could be challenged by a sufficiently capable human mind. The Bene Tlilax, the genetic sorcerers who grew golas and face dancers and who kept their own counsel about everything, had their own long-term calculations that Paul's continued existence complicated. And Irulan, trained Bene Gesserit, loyal to the sisterhood's long-term interests, had been providing information to parties whose interest in those long-term plans she shared. The conspiracy produced a gola. They took the cells of Duncan Idaho, dead now, dead at his station on the night of the Arrakis attack, dead in exactly the way that a man who was Duncan Idaho would die, and they grew a new body from those cells, and they trained that body and shaped it and named it Hate, and they sent it to Paul as a gift. A mentat and a swordmaster and a companion and a weapon, all in one body, carrying in its rebuilt neurons a specific lethal instruction that the conspiracy believed Paul would eventually trigger. Paul received it. He accepted the gola knowing, or nearly knowing, what it was. The prescience did not always clarify at the level of specific tactical details. It worked better at the scale of large patterns than at the scale of individual decisions, but the overall shape of what was happening was visible to him. He kept the Gola because he believed he could manage what was coming, or because he was willing to risk what was coming, or because the alternative was a decision that foreclosed options he was not ready to close off. He was also in the way that people are who have grown up with someone and lost them, simply glad to have Duncan back in any form. This is not a diplomatic calculation. This is the truth. Alia governed alongside him. She was regent in the organizational sense, the official authority on Arrakis when Paul was elsewhere, the person who held the threads together when the demands of governing an interstellar empire required him to be in multiple places simultaneously, which was always. She was also his sister, the pre-born child who had emerged from Jessica's ordeal, carrying other memory from before she had a self to separate it from, who had grown up in the Fremen sietch, holding herself together against the chorus of ancestral voices by sheer force of will and intelligence and the specific stubbornness that survival in the desert instilled in the people it permitted to survive. She was extraordinary. The word is inadequate, but it is the available word. She was 4 years old and simultaneously ancient in a way that the word ancient was not built to describe. She fought with the capability of someone who had been training in personal combat for her entire life, plus all the lives she carried, who had access to the accumulated physical memory of every female ancestor in her line. She understood political situations with a complexity that adults twice her age could not access, because she could reference not just her own experience, but the experience of every woman in the ancestral record who had navigated equivalent situations. She was also holding something very still. The preborn condition was not simply dangerous because of the historical record the Bene Gesserit maintained about what happened to preborn children. It was dangerous because of the specific structural reality of what it meant to have other memory fully active before the individual self had developed the architecture to contain it. To be surrounded from the very beginning of consciousness by other voices, other personalities, other perspectives that were as vivid and as present as anything the current self experienced, and to maintain a coherent center against that constant pressure. The holding required effort. The effort was continuous, and continuous effort, sustained over years, over decades, eventually reaches the threshold at which it cannot be sustained indefinitely. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was in her ancestral record. He was there because he was in the Harkonnen bloodline, and the Harkonnen bloodline was in Jessica's lineage, a detail the Bene Gesserit had arranged with their characteristic combination of foresight and opacity, the specifics of which neither Jessica nor Paul had been fully informed about. The Baron was not the only dangerous voice in Alia's other memory, but he was the most persistent and the most skilled at finding the spaces in her attention where the holding became momentarily imprecise, and in those spaces offering things. Counsel, clarity, a perspective that was often accurate and always directed toward his own ends. She was fighting this, Paul understood. He could see it in the probability space, and he could see it in her behavior, and he could see it in the specific quality of her attention when she thought no one was paying attention to her. He loved her, and he was afraid for her, and the fear existed alongside a helplessness that the prescience made specific and complete. He could see the shape of where she was going, and he could not see a path that got her somewhere else. The stone burner came, a weapon of the conspiracy designed to destroy sight without destroying life. The specific cruelty of an instrument that took from Paul the physical faculty while leaving him the prescient one, leaving him to navigate the world through the vision that had been both his greatest capability and his most insidious trap. The vision did not require eyes. He could still see, in the sense that mattered for navigation and political strategy and the broad management of the world. He could not see in the sense that seeing is connected to the immediate, the present, the particular texture of the face of the person in front of you that carries information that no amount of prescient vision can provide. He was blind. Chani died in childbirth, the twins, Leto and Ganima, arriving at the cost of their mother's life. The specific brutality of a universe that extracted payment for everything at the moment when the payment would be hardest to afford. She died, and the world that had organized itself around the fact of her, the ground that Paul had stood on when the visions showed him only fire, was simply gone. He walked into the desert. This is the tradition, the specific Fremen tradition, the thing that the desert culture had developed for exactly this kind of death. The blind man who was no longer capable of the full participation that desert survival required, who could not see the worm sign, who could not perform the sand walk with the accuracy that open desert demanded, who had passed beyond the point at which the community could carry him without cost to itself. The custom was to walk into the open sand, to give yourself back to the desert, to complete the relationship that the desert had always described as a return rather than an ending. He walked into the desert knowing it was a tradition, and knowing he was fulfilling it, and knowing that fulfilling it was, in some deep way, the most honest thing available to him. He had presided over the jihad he had seen coming and had not found the path around it. He had governed an empire built on a foundation he had questioned from the beginning. He had watched the woman he loved die in the act of giving him children he could not see with eyes that no longer worked. The desert, which had made him what he was, and asked everything of him that the making required, was waiting for him in the traditional way, and he went. He was not found. The Fremen said he was there, somewhere in the deep desert. One more thing that the sand had swallowed in the particular way the sand swallowed everything it loved, completely, without remainder, leaving nothing visible from outside to mark that something had been there. He was 35 years old, in biological terms. He had been emperor for 12 years. He had been Paul Atreides for his entire life, and that entire life had been spent, from the first moment of training to the last step into the open sand, in the process of becoming what the desert needed him to be. What he left behind was complicated, in the way that everything consequential is complicated. The jihad had ended, technically. The military phase was over. The political settlements had been made. The great houses of the Landsraad had been reorganized around the new reality of Atreides supremacy, which meant the new reality of Fremen supremacy, which meant the new reality of a spice economy that ran on different terms than the Harkonnen exploitation had established. Arrakis was the center of the universe, in a way it had always been economically, but had not always been politically, and the people who actually knew the desert, the people who had been living in it since before the Imperium survey ships had arrived to catalogue its resources, were for the first time in their history the people whose knowledge and presence and continued cooperation was officially recognized as necessary. This was not nothing. It was, by any reasonable measure, an enormous improvement on what had existed before. The Fremen's transformation from invisible population to official power was real, was permanent, was not going to be undone by the political adjustments that would inevitably follow any major transfer of authority. The jihad's cost was real too. The 61 billion dead were real. The 90 sterilized planets were real. The specific devastation of a religious war conducted with the specific capability that the Fremen's centuries of desert, sharpened fighting had accumulated. This was real, and the reality of it was distributed across the universe in forms that did not resolve simply because the military phase ended. Paul had not wanted this. This is the thing the mythology consistently misrepresents. The thing that the careful reader of what Herbert wrote in the sequels understands, the thing that the figure of Muad'Dib as cosmic archetype tends to obscure. Paul Atreides did not want the jihad. He saw it coming, and he could not find a way around it, and he chose the least terrible version of it that the probability space made available, which was still terrible. The specific quality of his tragedy is not that he did terrible things, but that he saw terrible things coming, and could not prevent them, could only shape them from within, could only be the best possible version of himself inside a situation that no version of himself could improve as much as the situation required improvement. His children survived. Leto and Ganima, pre-born themselves, carrying other memory from before their individual selves had formed, growing up in a world shaped by their father's choices, inheriting the specific combination of gifts and responsibilities that those choices had produced. Leto would become something that made even Paul's transformation seem modest by comparison. Ganima would survive and rule and carry the family's story forward in ways that her parents' mythology tended to overshadow. Elia governed as regent, and the governing deteriorated, as Paul had seen it would and could not prevent. The pre-born condition reached its limit, and the Baron's voice won enough ground to change what she was, gradually in the specific way that consciousness is changed by the thing it cannot stop fighting, by becoming, finally, too tired to keep the fight up. This was not her failure. It was the failure of a situation that should never have been created, and that the people who created it, Bene Gesserit, circumstances, the specific biological reality of what the water of life did to a consciousness that had not yet developed the architecture to receive it, had not been able to prevent. Paul walked in the desert and was not found, and became something that the legend required, the blind prophet who chose the tradition over survival, who gave himself back to the desert rather than accepting the compromised existence that survival without Chani and without sight would have required, who completed the specific Fremen relationship with death that the Fremen had always described as a return rather than an ending. He was also, and this is what remains when the mythology is set aside, a person who had been born on a world where it rained, and had become the most powerful man in the known universe by learning what a desert required of the people who lived in it. A person whose father had taught him that power was a responsibility before it was a privilege, and who had tried, imperfectly and at enormous cost to everyone around him, to exercise power on those terms in a situation that the terms were not built to manage. He made the jihad. The jihad made him. The desert made both of them, and received them both in the end, which is what the desert does with everything it loves. The question that Paul Atreides' life poses is not the question that the mythology usually asks. The mythology asks, was he the one? Was he the Messiah that the prophecy described? Did he fulfill what he was made for? These are interesting questions, but they are the wrong questions. They are the questions of a universe that is interested in prophecy and fulfillment, in the closing of circles and the completion of arcs, in the satisfying logic of design. Paul Atreides' life was not satisfying in that way. It was not the story of a prophecy being fulfilled. It was the story of what happens to a human being who is given more capability than any human being should carry, and more foreknowledge than any human being can live with comfortably, and who tries with those tools and those burdens to do the thing his father taught him was the right thing. To govern as if the governed were real. To use power as if power had a purpose beyond its own perpetuation. He failed in many of the specific ways that his prescient vision showed him he would fail. He succeeded in some of the ways that the vision showed as possible. He paid costs that the mythology prefers to describe as sacrifice rather than loss, though they were both simultaneously in the way that all consequential human losses are both simultaneously. The specific question Frank Herbert was asking, through Paul, through the jihad, through the systematic exploration in the later novels of what Paul's choices produced, was not whether Paul was a hero or a villain. It was whether the hero-villain framework was adequate to the situation. Whether a human being could be simultaneously the best available option and a catastrophic mistake, whether prescience, the ability to see the future, was a gift or a trap or something more complex than either of those words could hold. The answer the novels provide, assembled across 6 books and decades of Herbert's sustained attention to the question, is yes. Yes to all of it. Paul was the best available option, and a catastrophic mistake, and the framework of hero-villain was not adequate to his situation, and prescience was a gift and a trap and more complex than either of those words. The question was the right question. The answer was everything the question was big enough to contain. He was born on a world where it rained. He died in a desert, or rather, he walked into a desert and was not found, which is what the Fremen mean when they say the desert received him, which is the specific way the desert marks the people it has made its own. The rain was still there on Caladan, falling freely from the sky, running down green mountains into harbours. It had been there before him, and it continued after him, and it had nothing to do with anything he had done or been. The desert, on the other hand, was different for his having been in it. Not much, not in ways visible from orbit, but the specific history of that specific world, the specific story of the people who had lived in it since before the Imperium arrived to catalogue it. The specific arc of what happened to human civilization in the decade of his governance and the decades that followed, all of this was different for him, having existed, having made the choices he made, having been what the desert made him when the desert had finished its work. He was Paul Atreides. He was Muad'Dib. He was the Kwisatz Haderach, the shortening of the way, the thing 90 generations of deliberate human breeding had been trying to produce. He was the Duke's son and the desert student and Chani's chosen and his father's inheritor and his sister's brother and his children's father and the jihad's instrument and the jihad's first critic. He was a person in an impossible situation who tried to do the right thing and who could see, in a way no one before him could see, exactly how far short of the right thing every available option fell, and who acted anyway, because the alternative was not acting, and not acting was its own kind of choice, with its own kind of consequences, and of all the terrible options the probability space contained, not acting was the one that led most reliably to the worst outcomes. The desert received him. The rain went on falling on Caladan, and nothing about the rain remembered him, and the desert kept his name in the sand. And let's go back to the beginning of it. Not to the birth, not to Caladan, but to the specific moment before anything irrevocable had happened, the moment when Paul Atreides was still the person his father intended him to become, rather than the person the desert would make him. The Duke was training him to govern. This sounds simple. It was not simple. The Duke Leto Atreides had a specific theory of what governance was for, a theory that the Imperium had spent 10,000 years systematically proving was eccentric in the way that genuine ethical conviction always looks eccentric when it is surrounded by enough pragmatic accommodation to make accommodation seem normal. Leto believed that power was legitimate only when it served the people who were subject to it. He believed this not as an abstract principle, but as a practical theory of political durability. Arrangements that served only those at the top were structurally fragile, because the people at the bottom had no investment in maintaining them and would support alternatives whenever alternatives became available. The Atreides had survived for so long, maintained the loyalty of their people for so long, built the kind of trust that allowed men like Duncan Idaho and Tufir Hawat and Gurney Halleck to give everything for the name. All of this was the product of actually governing by the principle rather than merely proclaiming it. Paul received this education in the specific way that some lessons are received, not through formal instruction, but through accumulated experience of watching someone do the thing the lesson was about. He watched his father resolve disputes. He watched him speak to his soldiers as though the soldiers' lives mattered, rather than as though the soldiers were instruments of the Duke's purposes. He watched him grieve, genuinely and without concealment, when Atreides' soldiers died in situations that required soldiers to die. He watched a man who understood that governing was a relationship, and that the terms of the relationship were not set by the governing party alone. This is what Paul carried into Arrakis, not the political theory which he could have extracted from books, the lived sense of what governance looked like when it was actually practiced according to the principle, the specific quality of presence that a person brings to other people when those people's reality is genuinely mattering to them, when the listening is actual rather than performed, when the authority is earned through demonstrated commitment rather than claimed through inherited right. The desert would test this. The desert tested everything. What the Fremen were and why they mattered, and why the Harkonnens' failure to understand them was not a tactical error but a philosophical one. This requires some attention. The Fremen had been on Arrakis for thousands of years, not as the Imperium understood presence, not as a catalogued population, not as a recognized political entity, not as a community whose existence had formal standing in any of the institutional arrangements that organized human life in the Badishah Imperium. They were invisible to the Imperium in the specific way that the Imperium was blind to. The people who existed outside the structures that the Imperium had built to categorize and manage the people it governed. The Fremen were not in the survey data, because the survey data had not been conducted with sufficient care to find them. They were not in the population records, because nobody in authority had been motivated to discover that the population records were wrong. The Harkonnens knew the Fremen existed. They knew this the way you know that vermin inhabit a warehouse you're trying to use, as a practical nuisance to be managed rather than as people whose presence reflected anything worth understanding. They killed Fremen when they found them in ways that were inconvenient. They occasionally enslaved them. They wrote them into their operational planning as a background threat, a variable representing the cost of maintaining security against desert raiders, a line in the budget rather than a category that required genuine reckoning. This was catastrophically wrong, and the wrongness was not accidental. It was the specific failure mode of an institution that understood power as domination rather than as relationship, that evaluated everything it encountered in terms of how it fit into the existing structures of control, rather than in terms of what it actually was. The Harkonnens saw the desert and saw a place to extract spice from. They saw the people of the desert and saw obstacles to efficient extraction. They never saw what the desert had made the people of the desert into, because seeing that would have required a quality of attention to something they had decided was beneath attention. What the desert had made the Fremen into was the most effective fighting force in the known universe. Not the most powerful in the sense of numbers or equipment, not the most sophisticated in the sense of logistics and command structure and the institutional memory of professional military organizations. The most effective in the specific sense that matters most in a guerrilla conflict against a conventional force. The most capable of achieving their objectives at the lowest possible cost to themselves. The most capable of surviving in the terrain that the conflict would be fought in. The most capable of inflicting damage and disappearing before the response could form. Fremen fighters had been shaped by selection pressures that no deliberate training program had ever matched. Every generation of Fremen since the first had been the generation that survived the desert's requirements. The ones who did not meet those requirements died, not through any deliberate culling, but through the specific mechanism of an environment that converted inadequacy into mortality with total reliability. What remained after thousands of years of this was a population whose physical and psychological characteristics reflected every adaptation that surviving in the harshest inhabited environment in the known universe could produce. They were fast. The still-suit training, the desert walk, the decades of moving across terrain where movement had to be precise and economical or it would kill you. These produced bodies that were efficient in ways that off-world training could not replicate, capable of sustained exertion in conditions that defeated soldiers who had been training for that exertion on gentler worlds. They were accurate. Desert hunters who developed imprecision did not survive long enough to pass the imprecision on. The marksmanship, the blade skill, the specific economy of force that allows a smaller person to defeat a larger one when every motion is exactly what it needs to be, these were not trained capabilities in the Fremen military. They were the biological and cultural residue of thousands of years of necessity. They were patient. This is perhaps the most underestimated quality in a fighting force, the ability to wait, to hold a position without detection, to conduct an operation over days or weeks rather than requiring the immediate gratification of engagement, to accept that the right moment is not always the available moment, and to defer until the right moment arrives. This patience was so deeply embedded in Fremen culture and practice that it functioned less like a discipline and more like a temperament. They were patient the way the desert was patient. They could wait. And they were motivated. The Bene Gesserit's Missionaria Protectiva had seeded Fremen culture with a specific religious framework that told them their suffering had purpose, that their long exile in the desert was preparation for something, that the one who would lead them out of it was coming. This was manufactured myth, cynically deployed for the sisterhood's own purposes, built with a sophisticated understanding of religious psychology that the Bene Gesserit had developed across millennia of exactly this kind of cultural installation. But manufactured myth, given enough generations to take root in a culture that genuinely needed the meaning it provided, becomes real myth. The Fremen's faith in the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, the one who would come to lead them, was genuine. It was as deeply felt as any faith can be felt. The fact that it had been planted by calculating women 3,000 years ago did not make it less present or less powerful in the people who held it. Paul arrived at the intersection of all of these forces. He arrived with the capabilities the Bene Gesserit had spent 90 generations producing in his bloodline. He arrived with the training that made those capabilities functional. He arrived fitting, with uncomfortable precision, the specific parameters that the Missionaria Protectiva's prophecy had described. He arrived in a desert that was making him faster and more patient and more attentive and more capable with every day that he survived in it. He arrived at a community that was ready, more than ready, had been waiting generations for exactly the catalyst that he represented. The combination was not inevitable. Paul could have arrived with all of these qualities and circumstances and still have been wrong in the specific ways that the wrong kind of leader can be wrong even with the right capabilities. The Fremen could have recognized the shape of his arrival and placed their faith in him and been betrayed by the difference between the figure the prophecy described and the person who showed up claiming the prophecy's mantle. What made the combination work was not the capabilities and not the circumstances. It was the Atreides quality, the specific thing his father had spent years trying to give him, the quality that made governance a relationship rather than a performance, the quality that made people feel that their reality was genuinely being received rather than managed. The Fremen tested everything and forgave very little, and demanded complete authenticity in the ways that mattered most to them. And Paul met the standard not by performing the myth, but by being, in the specific ways that the desert could evaluate, genuinely adequate to what the desert and its people required. The prescience deepened as the desert time accumulated. To understand what happened to Paul's vision over the 2 years in the desert before the battle for Arrakis, it helps to understand what the prescience actually was and what it was not. It was not prophecy in the sense that most cultures use the word, not a revelation of a fixed future. Not a message from outside the normal causal structure of events about what would inevitably occur. The future that Paul perceived was not fixed. It was probabilistic. It was a landscape of more and less likely outcomes, weighted by the accumulated forces operating in the present, continuously updating as those forces changed. He was not reading a prophecy. He was solving an extraordinarily complex system of equations in real time, using a faculty that operated faster than conscious analysis could track, producing outputs that had the felt character of vision because the faculty worked through perceptual experience rather than through abstract calculation. This distinction matters because it explains the specific quality of Paul's experience of the future and the specific nature of the trap it set for him. A fixed future is straightforward, at least in its emotional logic. You receive the revelation, you understand what is going to happen, you either accept it or struggle against it, but you understand the terms of the struggle. The struggle is between your will and a determined outcome. This is the straightforward version of prescience. What Paul had was not this. What Paul had was the experience of standing at the center of a probability field that he could perceive with something approaching direct sensory access, in which the paths that led to the worst outcomes were the widest and most clearly grooved paths. Worn down by the weight of all the forces pushing toward them, and in which the paths that led to less catastrophic outcomes were narrow and required continuous active effort to stay on, and were not clearly distinguished from inside them, from paths that would eventually merge back into the catastrophic grooves. This is a different trap from the trap of fixed fate. It is the trap of knowing too much, not of knowing what will happen, but of knowing what is likely to happen, and knowing that the likely thing is bad, and knowing that the less likely things are not much better, and having to act anyway, in real time, without the ability to stop and fully assess before the situation has moved past the moment of decision. The spice was deepening his access to this probability field. Every day on Arrakis, every dose of the melange that was now in his food, and his water and the air he breathed, was opening the faculty further, making the vision clearer and more complex, giving him more information and simultaneously giving him more information to manage. The vision was becoming something that did not switch off, that was not limited to the dream states where it had first appeared, but was present in waking perception, integrated with ordinary sensory experience in a way that made it difficult to say where perception of the present ended and perception of the probable future began. The difficulty was not simply cognitive. It was existential, in the most precise sense of that word. It threatened the basic conditions that make human selfhood possible. Human identity is built on the assumption of a relatively open future, on the experience of standing before choices that are genuinely open, that could go either way, whose resolution depends in a meaningful sense on what you decide and do. This experience of genuine choice, of genuine contingency, of a future that is not determined before you arrive at it, this is not just pleasant, it is structurally necessary for the kind of self that human beings are. It is what makes action feel like action rather than performance. The prescient consciousness that Paul was developing was not compatible at full saturation with this experience. When the probable outcomes of a choice are visible before the choice is made, and visible with something approaching the clarity and specificity of memory, the choice does not feel like a choice. It feels like the execution of a known program. The future arrives confirming rather than surprising, filling in details in a template that the vision already held. The self that was supposed to be choosing becomes instead the instrument of a process that was already visible before the choosing. Paul's resolution, not full resolution, not a resolution that ended the problem, but the specific accommodation he made with it over the desert years, was something like this: to hold the prescience as information rather than letting it become destiny, to make decisions in the present rather than in the vision, to treat the vision's outputs as one input among several rather than as the program that the decision was executing. This worked. Partially, it worked enough to maintain the experience of choosing even in the presence of knowledge that threatened to make choosing feel pointless. It did not work completely, because the knowledge was there regardless of what he chose to do with it, and knowledge of what is most likely to happen. When the likelihood is high enough and the knowledge is clear enough, has a gravitational pull that partial accommodation can reduce but cannot eliminate. He rode it. He rode the prescient faculty the way he rode the sandworms, not by fighting it, not by pretending it was not what it was, but by learning to stand on it, to use its movement rather than being used by it, to direct it with the specific combination of attention and yielding that the worms also required. He was not entirely successful. He was more successful than anyone before him had been, because no one before him had the specific combination of training and capability and situational necessity that the desert years provided. He was less successful than he needed to be, because the situation he was navigating exceeded the capacity of any individual management strategy to fully handle. There was a conversation between Paul and Stilgar that Herbert does not write directly, but that everything written around it implies. It was a conversation about what the Fremen expected from the figure the prophecy described, and what Paul was actually going to be able to provide, and the gap between those two things. Stilgar was not a credulous man. He was a naib, which meant he was a person whose community had trusted him with the management of their survival, which meant he was a person who had learned to evaluate things on their merits rather than on their symbolic significance, because the cost of being wrong in the desert was too immediate to permit the luxury of symbolic thinking. He believed in the prophecy in the specific way that a practical man believes in things, not as a theological certainty, but as a working framework, a way of organizing the significance of events that would otherwise be difficult to organize. The Lisanal Gaib was coming. Something was coming, something that would change what the Fremen were, and what they were capable of, and what they could ask of the universe they had been living in the margins of for thousands of years. When Paul arrived, Stilgar was willing to entertain the possibility that Paul was that thing, and was willing to calibrate that possibility upward as Paul demonstrated what he was actually capable of. What Stilgar was not doing was assigning Paul the mythological role before Paul had demonstrated he was worthy of it. This is the specific quality of the Fremen's relationship with their prophet that distinguished them from many other cultures that had received manufactured prophecies and lost the ability to evaluate their prophecy's fulfillment with any critical faculty. Stilgar tested Paul. He continued testing Paul. He assessed what Paul did against what the desert required, and he adjusted his assessment as the evidence accumulated. What Paul was learning in these implicit conversations, in the ongoing evaluation that Stilgar conducted simply by being himself and requiring Paul to meet the standards that being himself required, was something that his Bene Gesserit training had given him the vocabulary for, but had not given him the full experiential depth of. He was learning what it meant to be accountable to the people you were supposed to serve, not in the abstract, but in the specific immediate form that the desert imposed. You demonstrate your worth, or you don't survive. And the desert doesn't care about your credentials, and the community that depends on the desert's judgments doesn't care about them either. He learned. He was always, throughout the entire arc of his life, a person who learned. Not in the passive sense of receiving information, but in the active sense of allowing what he encountered to change what he was. The desert changed him. The Fremen changed him. Stilgar's assessment, offered without warmth but also without dishonesty, was one of the most valuable inputs he received during the years that made him what he became. Chani taught him the worms. This is not a metaphor. She literally taught him how to call a sandworm, how to mount it, how to ride it, how to direct it through the open desert. She did this with the patient directness of someone for whom this knowledge was as fundamental as knowing how to walk. Not a special skill, not an accomplishment, but a basic competency that adults had, that you learned because you lived here and living here required it. What the worm riding meant to Paul, beyond the physical reality of it, was specific and significant. The sandworm was not a vehicle. It was Shai Hulud, the ancient thing, the maker, the source of the spice. The apex of the ecological system that had produced the compound that was changing his consciousness and the planet that was changing his soul. To ride the worm was to be in direct physical contact with the deepest layer of what Arrakis was. Not the surface, not the civilization, not even the Fremen and their culture and their faith, which were themselves products of the desert's shaping over thousands of years. The worm itself, the thing beneath everything, the thing that made the spice and had been making it since long before any human foot had touched this sand. The first ride was terrifying in a way that Paul did not allow to show, because showing it would have been wrong in the context of what the ride meant. The Fremen did not make their first worm rides at 30-something meters of speed on creatures that could swallow a building while being terrified, or rather they were terrified, and that was not the point. The point was doing it anyway. The point was being present in the doing of it with enough complete attention that the terror became simply one more input in the management of the immediate situation, neither denied nor allowed to dominate. After the first ride, the subsequent ones were different, not less demanding. Every ride was different because every worm was different and every stretch of desert was different, and every combination of speed and wind and terrain required its own specific management. But the relationship changed. He was no longer encountering the worm as something alien. He was beginning to encounter it as part of the ecology he was also part of. The largest and most ancient member of the community of things that lived in this sand. He was learning to feel its movement the way you learn to feel the movement of a horse, not by analysis, but by accumulated bodily experience, by the gradual accumulation of a sense of the worm's specific kind of agency and capability and limitation. Chani watched him learn this and did not tell him what she saw in his learning, because that was not how the Fremen taught things. You showed what was required. You waited while the other person developed the capability to do what was required. If they developed it, you taught the next thing. The teaching was the doing. The assessment was in whether the doing continued to be possible. She was also, in the context of all of this, becoming something in his life that the myths would later reduce to the simplest possible frame, his concubine, his true love, the counterweight to Irulan's political necessity. The simplification is understandable as simplification always is, and wrong in the ways that simplifications always are. She was a person, specific, complex, formed by a specific life in a specific world, carrying her own set of histories and priorities and the specific quality of attention that the desert had given her for navigating between what was real and what was being performed. She recognized that Paul was not performing. This was the central thing, the thing that the Fremen most needed to know about anyone who claimed the mythological significance that the Lisan al-Gaib tradition attached to Paul's arrival. The desert had taught the Fremen to recognize performance. Surviving in the desert required it. The person who was performing competence rather than having it was a liability, and in the desert liabilities became bodies. She saw through what Paul was presenting and found, behind it, something that was genuinely adequate to what was being asked. This recognition preceded love, but it made love possible in the specific way that love between desert people was possible, not as the surrender of separate selves to a merged one, but as the recognition of two people who were each genuinely themselves, and who found in the other something that they valued as genuinely as they valued their own integrity. The water of life came at the right moment, which is another way of saying it came at the only moment available. Paul had been in the desert for close to 2 years. The spice saturation had been building steadily. In his eyes, his perception, his prescient faculty, in the slowly deepening quality of the visions that no longer felt like anything other than another mode of perception. He had reached the point that the Bene Gesserit's accumulated experience with press science students documented as the threshold, the point at which the faculty was fully present and capable and was simultaneously preventing the full integration that would allow it to be used without being consumed by it. The water of life was the key that opened the final door. Not a gentle key. The water of life was a poison, the liquid exhalation of a drowned sandworm, specifically toxic to human neurochemistry in ways that killed most people who consumed it. It killed them not because it was simply lethal, which most things could be lethal, but because it activated neural pathways that required a specific quality of consciousness to process safely. And most consciousnesses did not have that quality. Paul's consciousness had been built toward having it by the specific convergence of genetics and training, and 2 years of the desert's chemistry working on both. He drank it, and he went under 3 weeks of coma, the body maintaining the biological functions that sustained life, while the consciousness was somewhere that was not exactly the same place as ordinary consciousness, processing the activation of faculties that could not be activated any other way. What happened in those 3 weeks is not fully available to description, for the same reason that other kinds of transformative experience resist the vocabulary built for ordinary experience. The ancestral record opened to him, not just the female line that female Reverend Mothers could access, but the male line as well, the dark places that the Bene Gesserit had been afraid to enter, the records of human violence and dominance and the will to power at its most direct and unmediated. He was inside the full range of human ancestral experience, male and female, the entire spectrum of what the species had done and been. He also gained full integration of the prescient faculty, not more of the same visions, but a different relationship with them. The faculty now available as a tool that he could hold and direct, rather than as a current that he was trying to avoid being swept away by. The vision was complete. He could see everything the probability space contained at the level of detail and with a quality of access that made it genuine navigation rather than approximate orientation. What he saw in that full clarity was the jihad. Not the outline of it, but the specific details, the branching paths, the costs. He saw 61 billion deaths as something approaching direct perception. He held this, and he made the choice that he would carry for the rest of his life, to move forward as the figure the probability space required, shaped by his own judgment about which of the available paths was least catastrophic, directed by his father's principle that power was a responsibility before it was a privilege, even when the exercise of that responsibility was going to cost more than. Any responsibility should cost. He woke, and he was Muad'Dib in a way that he had not been before, not the name which he had had for almost 2 years, but the reality, the full realization of what the name pointed toward. He was the Kwisatz Haderach, he was the shortening of the way. He was the figure the prophecy had been promising, and the person the breeding program had been building toward, and the leader the Fremen's faith had been waiting for. He was also Paul Atreides, the Duke's son, the boy from Caladan, the person who had wept over the first man he killed because the death had cost something real, regardless of its necessity. He was all of this simultaneously, which is the specific challenge that the legend tends to flatten by resolving it into the mythological figure and leaving the person underneath less visible. The battle showed him what the Fremen were when their faith was given a reason and their capability was given a direction. He had known this intellectually. He had watched them in combat. He had participated in the raids against Harkonnen spice operations, had seen what Fremen fighters did in their own terrain against forces that did not understand the terrain. He had the prescient knowledge of the battle's probable outcomes, had run the scenarios in his mentat training and in the vision, had arrived at the battle with a detailed model of what was likely to happen and under what conditions. What he had not known, could not know in advance, was what it felt like from inside it. The storm came through the gap he had opened in the shield wall, and arrived at the Imperial encampment with the violence of a geological event. Because that is what a Coriolis storm on Arrakis is. Not weather, not the weather of water-rich worlds, but the planetary machinery of an environment that had been optimizing its response to human attempts to cross it for millions of years. The sand did not merely blow, it scoured, it removed, it reduced. The worm cavalry arrived through the storm, and this is the image that the records from the battle preserve most vividly. The Fremen riders emerging from the wall of driven sand on the backs of sandworms, silhouettes of something that the Sardaukar had no institutional framework for responding to. Because no institutional framework had ever been developed for responding to it. The most feared soldiers in the known universe stood in the path of the desert itself, given direction and velocity and the specific quality of total commitment that comes from people who are certain that they are doing the work of God. The Sardaukar held longer than most forces would have held. This is not a minor thing. The Sardaukar had been shaped by Seleucus Secundus, the imperial prison world, the place the emperor used to produce soldiers of extraordinary quality through the mechanism of letting the environment kill everyone it could and keeping what survived, and what survived was extraordinary. They fought with the precision and the courage that their training and their selection had produced. It was not enough. Against Fremen riders on Arrakis, in a Coriolis storm, with the desert itself functioning as an instrument of the battle, the Sardaukars' extraordinary capabilities were insufficient against what was being deployed against them. Paul found the Emperor afterward, Shaddam IV, stripped of his military advantage, facing the specific political reality that his Sardaukar had been defeated by desert fighters, was no longer the figure whose word was law across hundreds of worlds. He was an old man who had made a catastrophic mistake and was now facing its consequences, which included but were not limited to a young man whose father Shaddam had helped murder, and who was now holding the Imperium in the balance. Paul was precise. He demanded the Emperor's daughter as wife, to provide his new political order with the dynastic legitimacy that the Carino name still carried. He demanded acknowledgement of his right to Arrakis. He threatened the spice, not metaphorically, but literally, in the specific terms of a man who controlled the planet that produced the only substance that kept the Imperium's most critical institutions functional, who was willing to destroy the source rather than let it be taken. The guild representatives present understood this threat with the specific quality of attention that beings who have reorganized their entire existence around a single substance give to credible threats to that substance. Irulan was there. She was watching everything with the attentiveness of a woman who had been trained since childhood to watch everything, who understood that she was witnessing events that would determine the shape of everything that followed, who was being delivered by her father's political failure into an arrangement that she had not chosen, and that she was already beginning to analyze for what it offered her, and what it required of her. She would write the histories. She would document Paul's life in the form that future generations would receive it. She would do this with the intelligence and commitment of someone who found in documentation the specific form of agency that her situation allowed. Chani watched the political theatre with the Fremen's characteristic ability to see through to function. She knew what it meant. She accepted what it meant. She was not the Empress. She did not need to be the Empress. She needed Paul to be what he was, and what he was, on the other side of the battle, on the other side of the Water of Life, on the other side of 2 years of the desert's curriculum, was sufficient to what she had recognized in him from the beginning. The years of the jihad did not pass easily for anyone who was paying attention. Paul governed from Arrakis, from the planet that had made him, because this was honest in a way that governing from the traditional imperial capital would not have been. He was the desert's product, and Arrakis's ruler, and he was not willing to perform the fiction of being a conventional emperor, with the conventional imperial machinery of a conventional capital city presenting the conventional face of power. He was Muad'Dib on Arrakis, and Arrakis was where he stayed. Irulan wrote. She wrote the accounts that would become the foundational texts of the Muad'Dib mythology, histories, analyses, philosophical reflections, the careful documentation of events and their contexts and meanings that required exactly the kind of intelligence she possessed and exactly the kind of access she had. She wrote with genuine care and genuine difficulty, because she was documenting a figure she had been placed beside for political reasons, a figure whose relationship to the mythology accumulating around him was more complicated than the mythology itself captured, and she was doing this while being herself a person whose situation was, in its own way, requiring comparable management. Paul read what she wrote and found it accurate in the ways that accuracy is possible, and incomplete in the ways that all documentation of a living person is incomplete, because the person is available to the documentation only from the outside, and there are inside things that the documentation cannot touch. He was also continuing to run the prescient faculty, which did not simplify as the governance years accumulated. If If anything, it deepened, became more complex, showed him more of the probability space with more detail and more emotional weight. The jihad's progress was visible to him at a level of detail that the official reports could not provide, and that the prescient vision provided without filtering. He knew what was happening on the worlds that his armies were reaching in his name. He knew the deaths. He knew them not as statistics, but as the vision's specific reality, which was something other than statistics. Something closer to what actually experiencing the deaths would be than any other mode of knowing he had access to. He looked for the path through. He had always been looking for the path through. Since the first clear vision in the desert, since the water of life had opened the faculty to its full depth, he had been running the probability space, looking for the configuration that led to outcomes that were not catastrophic. He found partial paths. He found ways of managing the jihad's momentum that reduced its scope in specific regions or extended the process of settlement in specific political situations, ways that saved lives in particular places while the overall pattern continued. He found no exit from the overall pattern. This is what Dune Messiah, the second novel, the continuation of Paul's story, is primarily about. Not the conspiracy against him, which is the surface narrative. The conspiracy is real, and its details matter, and its execution produces the specific catastrophe of the stone burner and Chani's death, and Paul's walking into the desert. But underneath the conspiracy plot is the exploration of what it meant to be the person Paul had become, 12 years into governing the consequences of his own choices, what it felt like from inside, what the prescient consciousness that had seemed like a gift when it first manifested looked like after 12 years of having it at full depth in the full complexity of its operation. It looked like a prison. Not a prison with bars, not a prison that constrained movement or access or the ordinary dimensions of human freedom. A prison that constrained the experience of genuine choosing. A prison built out of knowing too much, out of having too much of the future already visible to maintain the felt sense of genuine contingency that makes choosing feel like choosing rather than like performance. Paul had known, since the water of life, that he was navigating a path through the probability space that led toward specific outcomes. The navigation required him to make choices that felt, from inside the navigation, less like choices and more like waypoints along a route he had already surveyed. The conspirators gave him something unexpected, the possibility of genuine surprise. He had seen the conspiracy coming, in its broad outlines. He had not seen every specific detail, because the prescient vision was not a complete specification of every event, and because several of the conspirators were operating with capabilities designed specifically to evade prescient detection. Edric the Guild Navigator, swimming in his tank of spice gas, was himself a human nexus of prescient influence, another user of the same faculty Paul used, creating in his presence a kind of local disruption of the probability field that clouded Paul's ability to see clearly what was happening in Edric's vicinity. The hate, the Gola they had built from Duncan Idaho's sails, arrived, and Paul received him, as Paul received everything, with the knowledge that this was part of something the conspiracy had constructed, and with the genuine response of a person who had lost Duncan Idaho on the night Arrakis was attacked, and who was now, in some sense, being given something back. The grief and the political calculation were not separate, they were simultaneous. This is how Paul experienced almost everything during the Dune Messiah period, the human response and the strategic analysis occupying the same moment, neither cancelling the other, both requiring management. Elia managed the regency. She was extraordinary at it, which was both a comfort and a concern. Extraordinary because she was her mother's daughter, and the product of the desert's education and the preborn's access to ancestral wisdom, a concern because the extraordinary management she was providing required the continuous, extraordinary effort of holding herself together against the pressure of other memory, and that pressure did not diminish. Chani had returned to the deep Fremen diet, the high-concentration spice foods that were native to desert life, foods that Irulan had been quietly working to keep from Chani's table as part of her own conspiracy to prevent Paul from having an heir with his Fremen concubine. When Chani discovered this and returned to her native diet, the spice levels she accumulated during the pregnancy were extraordinary, concentrations that neither the Fremen tradition nor the Bene Gesserit knowledge had fully anticipated in combination with a developing consciousness. Paul saw this. He saw it in the vision. He saw what it meant for the twins she was carrying, the specific thing that the water of life exposure in utero produced, the pre-born condition, other memory activated before the architecture to contain it had developed. He saw Elia in his children's probable future. He saw what that meant. He did not prevent it, because he could not prevent it in the way that the prevention would have required, which was to prevent Chani from being who she was, from living according to the practices that were as natural to her as breathing, which was to prevent being in this specific situation with this specific person in this specific world. The impossibility was not external, it was internal to the thing itself. The stone burner came at a moment that the conspiracy had calibrated, though not with full knowledge of what Paul's blindness would and would not take from him. It took his eyes. It did not take his vision. He could still navigate by the prescient faculty, still perceive the world around him with the specific quality of attention that the faculty provided, still function in all the ways that the governance and the navigation and the management of the probability space required. What it took was the specific seeing that required the physical faculty, the immediate texture of the present moment that the eyes provide. The quality of the person in front of you that no amount of prescient vision can fully substitute for. He could see the probable futures. He could not see Chani's face in the present. Chani died in childbirth. The twins lived, Leto and Ganima, pre-born, as Paul had seen they would be, carrying other memory from the beginning of their individual lives, already ancient in the specific way that the pre-born were ancient, already managing what no consciousness that had just arrived in the world should have to manage. They were real, and they were alive, and they were the children Paul had wanted, and they were also, unavoidably, the beginning of a story that Paul could see the shape of, and that Elia was going to be part of in ways that were already visible in the probability space. He walked into the desert. He did this as the Fremen tradition required of a man who could no longer perform the sandwalk with the accuracy that survival in the open desert demanded, who had passed beyond the point at which the community's resources could extend to carrying him. He did it as the Fremen tradition required, and he did it because there was nothing else available. He had governed the jihad he had not wanted. He had presided over the costs he had not been able to prevent. He had arrived at the specific endpoint that the probability space had shown him was the most likely outcome, and he walked into it with the specific quality of the man his father had tried to make him, without pretense, without performance, with the honest acknowledgement of what was real and what was required, and what a man could do about those things when they had arrived at the end of what could be done. He was not found. This is the standard phrasing in the histories. He walked into the desert and was not found. The desert received him in the way it received everything it had made and finished with. The records close on this fact, and the mythology opens where the records close, the specific place where absence becomes symbol, becomes faith. What remained? The twins grew. Elia ruled as regent, and the rule deteriorated in the specific ways that Paul had foreseen and had not been able to prevent. The pre-born condition reaching its limit, the Baron's voice in her ancestral record winning the ground that sustained effort over years, finally wins when the effort can no longer be fully sustained. This was tragedy. It was also the specific kind of tragedy that the universe Herbert was constructing required, the tragedy of a consciousness that had been asked to hold more than any single consciousness could hold indefinitely, and that eventually could not hold it any more. Leto and Ganima survived her. Leto transformed himself in a way that made even Paul's transformation seem modest in comparison. Took on the sand-trout symbiosis, became the God Emperor, ruled for 3,500 years under the specific dispensation of the Golden Path, the long plan whose necessity he saw clearly, and whose cost he accepted with the specific quality of despair that someone accepts when they have looked at every alternative and found all of them worse than the thing they are accepting. The God Emperor's transformation was, in some sense, the completion of what Paul had begun. Paul had ridden the wave of the jihad, had chosen to be the catalyst rather than to seek the impossible path of non-catalysis, had trusted that his presence at the center of the catastrophe was better than his absence from it, had governed the fire as best he could with the tools available to him. Leto extended this logic to its terminal point, chose a transformation so total and so costly that it could not be understood within the frameworks that Paul had inherited from his father and the desert, could only be understood within the framework that Leto constructed for himself on the far side of everything that made ordinary human experience possible. Paul saw this in the vision. He saw Leto and Ganima and what they were going to have to do and what it was going to cost and what the alternative was. He made his choice to walk into the desert rather than to continue governing in the presence of this knowledge. Whether his withdrawal was wisdom or failure is not a question with a clean answer. It is the question of a life that was too large for clean answers, too consequential for the categories that clean answers require. He was the Duke's son. He was the Kwisatz Haderach. He was the jihad's catalyst and the desert's student and the vision's prisoner and the person who had wept over the first man he killed, because the death was real regardless of its necessity, who had loved Chani with the specific quality of love that survives the mythology built around it by being itself rather than performing its role, who had tried, for the entire arc of a life that was too large for ordinary description, to exercise power with the principle his father had given him. The rain still falls on Caladan. The desert still holds the name Muad'Dib in the sand. The sandworms still move through the erg on their geological schedules, producing the spice that the universe needs and the civilization depends on, and no one has ever been able to manufacture or replace or fully understand. He was Paul Atreides. He remains, in whatever sense a person who has walked into a desert and been received by it remains, exactly what the desert made him. No more and no less than that, and there is a specific thing that happens to a person when they are given a role that is simultaneously too large for any individual to fulfill and too important to leave unfilled. Paul Atreides lived inside this paradox for most of his adult life, not as an abstract philosophical condition, not as the kind of existential predicament that a person contemplates in safety and uses to generate interesting thoughts about the nature of selfhood and choice. As a lived reality, with specific costs measured in specific deaths and specific losses, and the specific daily experience of navigating a situation that the available tools were not adequate to. The Bene Gesserit had built him for a purpose. This is not metaphor. 90 generations of deliberate breeding, selecting for the specific combination of capabilities that the sisterhood needed in a male who could access what reverend mothers could not access, who could hold the full range of other memory, who could bring to prescient perception a quality of consciousness that the Guild Navigator's mutation had achieved in one direction, but not the other. They had wanted him to be their instrument. They had wanted to produce the Kwisatz Haderach at the right moment, under controlled conditions, available to be shaped and directed toward the sisterhood's long-term management of the human species' development. He arrived a generation early. He arrived in the wrong bloodline. Not wrong in the sense of being without the required capabilities, which were clearly present, but wrong in the sense of being the son of a man the Bene Gesserit had not controlled, and a woman who had, by the choice of her own heart, done something the sisterhood had specifically prohibited. She had borne a son instead of the required daughter, because she loved Leto Atreides and knew he wanted a son, and because her love was stronger than her institutional obligation. This is the specific origin of Paul's existence as a problem for the Bene Gesserit. He was the product of a love that did not serve the sisterhood's plans. He was the intended creation, made real by the wrong mechanism. The sisterhood had been aiming at something, and what their aiming had produced had arrived through a path that left it outside their management. The situation this created was not merely political. It was the specific situation of a figure who was supposed to serve an institutional purpose that the institution could not now direct him toward, whose capabilities exceeded the institution's ability to manage, whose existence was simultaneously the validation of the institution's entire long-term project and the demonstration that the long-term project had produced something beyond the institution's ability to contain. Paul understood this. He understood it with the mentats' analytical clarity and the prescient faculty's specific insight into the web of motivations operating around him and the Bene Gesserit training that gave him access to exactly the framework through which the sisterhood understood itself and its purposes. He was inside the institution that had made him in the sense that its training and its breeding had produced what he was, and outside it in the sense that its purposes and his own had diverged in the moment his mother chose love over duty. He was not bitter about this. Bitterness would have been too simple a response to a situation whose complexity was one of its most important features. He was something more like wary, aware of what the sisterhood wanted, aware of what he was to them, aware of the specific ways in which their long-term management of the human species' development was both genuinely valuable and genuinely insufficient to the situation that his existence had created. The relationship between Paul and the prescience deserves more examination than the broad strokes provide, because what happened to him through the progressive activation of that faculty is the central thread running through everything that his story explores. Consider the specific quality of prescient experience at its most fully developed. Paul, in the years after the Water of Life, was perceiving probability space with something that had become a continuous background faculty, not switched off between uses, not limited to deliberate consultations, but present in the way that peripheral vision is present, always operating, always providing information at the edges of conscious attention. The difference between his waking life and a prescient trance was the difference between engaging the faculty directly and allowing it to run in the background while other mental activities occupied the foreground. This continuous background operation meant that every situation he entered was already preceded by the probability analysis. He was never quite arriving at something fresh, never quite encountering something for the first time, without the vision's advanced processing. The specific quality of presence that his father had modelled, the full engagement with what was immediately in front of you, the complete attentiveness to the person you were currently talking to. This was structurally more difficult to achieve when the faculty that was evaluating probable outcomes was always running. He compensated. He found techniques, Bene Gesserit derived, mostly, but adapted to his specific situation, for directing the faculty's output into a manageable register, for making the background vision less intrusive in the foreground of immediate experience. He managed, as he managed most things, with the combination of genuine intelligence and the specific kind of discipline that only develops under sustained pressure. He could not manage it completely. The faculty was too pervasive, too continuous, too deeply integrated with his basic cognitive functioning by the years of spice saturation to be reduced to something that operated only when he wanted it to. And what this meant in the practical daily experience of being Paul Atreides, Emperor of the known universe, was that he was always somewhere between the present and the probable futures, always navigating in the space between what was happening and what was likely to happen, never quite fully in the moment the way that people who are not prescient are sometimes fully in their moments. Chani grounded him. This is not a soft observation about the value of love. It is a specific, functional observation about what her presence provided him in the context of the specific thing that the prescience was doing to his relationship with ordinary experience. She was completely present. She did not have the faculty. She was in her moments with the full Fremen quality of presence, the attentiveness that the desert had produced in the people it shaped, the inability to be elsewhere than where you were, because where you were was the desert, and the desert did not permit divided attention. When he was with her, her presence pulled him toward the present. Not completely, the faculty ran regardless, but enough to create the specific counterweight that the prescience was too strong to create for itself. She was the ground. When she died, what he lost was not simply her, though her was already everything. He lost the ground. The prescience continued without the counterweight. The probable futures were equally present, and there was no living anchor pulling back toward the now. He walked into the desert 3 weeks after the twins were born. This is the official timing in the records, and it is probably approximately correct, allowing for the various ways that grief disrupts time's ordinary flow. He walked into the desert, and the desert received him, and the records close on the fact of his walking. Let's look at what his choices actually were, at the specific decision points that the mythology tends to flatten into the inevitable. The moment of the water of life, the moment when he could see the jihad completely and chose to move forward. Was this choice available to be made differently? The probability space said no, or near enough to know that the paths that did not lead through the jihad led somewhere the vision showed was worse. Not necessarily worse by the same measure, not fewer deaths necessarily, though the vision showed some versions of the avoided jihad future with death tolls that exceeded the jihad's 61 billion, but worse in a structural sense, in the sense of leading to configurations of human civilization that the vision showed as less capable of sustaining themselves, less likely to produce outcomes over the long term that were worth the short-term cost of arriving at them. Paul was not making this calculation coldly. He was making it in the specific anguish of a person who understood exactly what the calculation was requiring him to do, to choose to be the catalyst of something he was horrified by, to choose this not because he wanted it, but because the alternatives, mapped in the probability space with the clarity of direct perception, were worse. He was doing the moral calculus of a person who had been given too much information about the consequences of available choices, and who was finding that the information, rather than clarifying the right choice, was simply making every choice more accurately terrible. He chose. He made the choice that seemed least terrible in the probability space, the choice that led through the catastrophe rather than around it, the choice that placed him at the center of the catastrophe rather than at a safe distance from it, in the hope, not certainty, not confidence, but the specific quality of hope that remains when confidence is unavailable. That being at the center gave him more influence over what the catastrophe produced than being anywhere else. The subsequent 12 years were not a failure of this hope, they were a partial realization of it. The jihad happened, and Paul shaped it from within the ways that the probability space showed were available, and the shaped version was better than the unmanaged version would have been, which is something, which is not nothing. Which is also not enough, and was always going to not be enough, and he knew this from the beginning. This is the specific quality of his tragedy that Herbert was most interested in, that the later novels explore most deeply. Not that Paul did terrible things and didn't care, not that he failed to see what was coming, but that he saw exactly what was coming and could not prevent it. Could only manage it from the inside, at the cost of being inside it, the cost of being the specific catalyst that made it happen while being present for everything that it produced. Gurney Halleck came back to Arrakis. This detail from the later stages of Paul's governance is worth attention because of what it demonstrates about the specific quality of Atreides' loyalty, and what that loyalty looked like in the context of everything that had happened since the Arrakis attack. Gurney had survived the attack on the household. He had escaped in the fighting, had eventually fallen in with a smuggler band operating the margins of Arrakis' spice trade, had spent years not knowing whether Paul and Jessica were alive. He had continued because continuing was what men like Gurney did. Not because continuing made obvious sense, not because there was a clear purpose that the continuation served, but because the capability and the commitment that he had built in service of the Atreides name did not simply dissolve when the immediate institutional context that had housed it was destroyed. He found Paul eventually because Paul was not hiding, was in fact governing the universe from Arrakis, and finding someone who is governing the universe from a specific planetary location is not a difficult navigational problem. But the finding had a specific character. Gurney did not simply arrive and present himself. He arrived carrying everything the years since the Arrakis attack had deposited in him, carrying the specific grief and specific guilt and specific uncertain hope of a man who had served his lord's family for most of his adult life and had then lost them, or thought he had lost them, or had been unable to prevent losing them, and who was now confronted with the fact that they had survived and he had not been there for the survival. Paul received him with the specific Atreides quality of genuine recognition, not the performance of recognition, not the emperor meeting a subject, but the person who had grown up with Gurney's ballad songs and Gurney's combat training and the specific quality of Gurney's loyalty that made the word loyalty feel like an undersell, meeting the person he had grown up with. This reunion, and what it meant about the continuity of relationship across the enormity of everything that had happened, is one of the clearest illustrations in the narrative of something that the mythology consistently struggles to preserve about Paul. That he was not, through all of it, simply the Emperor Muad'Dib of the legend. He was also the person who remembered Gurney's music, and who was genuinely glad to have Gurney back. The person remained. Under the prophecy fulfillment and the jihad management and the prescient navigation and the political calculation, under all of it, the person remained. The boy who had wept over the first man, he killed. The son who had received his father's governance lesson and tried to live it. The desert student who had learned the sandwalk from Charney and the worm riding from the Fremen and the specific quality of being present that the desert required as the price of existing in it. The person who loved Charney in the way that cuts through all the mythology to something simply and undeniably true. The mythology wants to dissolve this person into the symbol. The symbol is easier to hold, easier to deploy in the service of faith and political purpose, and the general human need for figures who mean something beyond their individual existence. The person is harder, more various, more contradictory, more capable of being wrong in small human ways, alongside being right in large historic ones. More interesting and less convenient. Herbert preserved the person throughout. This is one of the most significant artistic choices in the saga, the insistence on Paul remaining through the entire arc from Caladan to the Desert Walk, a human being rather than a symbolic function. The tragedy works because the person we are watching make the choices and bear the costs is a person, not an archetype. The archetype is there too, the Kwisatz Haderach, the messianic figure, the prophesied one, but it is always in relation to a person, and it is the relationship between the person and the archetype that is the actual subject of the story. He was also wrong about some things. This is not a minor point. Paul was wrong about the jihad's scope. He chose the path that led through it, believing that the path he was on was the least costly version of the catastrophe, and the catastrophe was as costly as he had seen in his worst visions, rather than as manageable as the more optimistic parts of the probability space had suggested. This does not mean the choice was the wrong choice. The alternatives he could see were worse. But the specific calibration of how bad this version would be was off, or the uncertainty in the vision was greater than the felt certainty of the prescient experience communicated. He was wrong about his ability to manage Aaliyah's trajectory. He saw where she was going, and he did not find a way to redirect it. He told himself that he had tried, and that the trying had been insufficient rather than that the trying had been absent, and this was probably true in the literal sense that he did try, that he made specific attempts to strengthen the architecture Aaliyah used to manage the other memory pressure. But the attempts were insufficient, which is not the same as the trying being sincere. The insufficiency is a fact. The sincerity does not change the fact. He was wrong in the way that every prescient consciousness is eventually wrong. The vision is probabilistic, not certain. And the specific calibration of probabilities at any given moment reflects the information available, and the quality of the faculty's operation, and both of these are imperfect. He was often right. He was not always right. The mythology treats his prescience as something closer to omniscience than the actual faculty justified, and this is one of the places where the mythology does Paul a disservice, not by giving him too much credit, but by flattening the specific texture of what the prescience actually was, which was something extraordinary and limited and genuinely useful and genuinely inadequate to the full scope of what it was being asked to navigate. The most significant wrong he held about himself was the belief, which he maintained across the full arc of his governance, that the costs he was presiding over were genuinely the minimum possible costs, that no other available choice would have produced lower costs, that the probability space had been searched thoroughly enough to rule out alternatives that he had not seen. This belief was probably correct. The probability space is large, and the computation required to navigate it fully is beyond what any single consciousness can perform, prescient or otherwise. But probably correct is not certainly correct, and the difference matters in a life that cost what his cost. He deserved, and the people who were subject to his governance deserved, more certainty than probably. He could not provide more certainty than probably. The faculty was what it was, and the situation was what it was, and the certainty that moral clarity requires was not available. He acted on the best available assessment, and the acting had the consequences it had. This is the most honest summary. It is not a comfortable summary. It is not the summary that the mythology provides, which is a summary in which the tragic hero's choices are vindicated by the eventual positive outcomes. The changes his governance made possible, the Fremen's liberation, the restructured political order, the specific progress toward the golden path that his son Leto would eventually complete at costs that made even Paul's costs look manageable. By comparison, the uncomfortable summary is, he acted on the best available assessment under conditions that would have defeated most other people entirely, produced outcomes that were catastrophically bad and less bad than the available alternatives, paid personal costs that were devastating, and walked into the desert at the end not as a triumphant figure completing a heroic arc, but as a person who had done what he could with what he had, and could not do more. The spice shaped all of it. Not just Paul's prescient faculty, everything. The cinnamon smell that hit him at the top of the ramp was already beginning to work on him before he had walked 10 meters on the planet's surface. The saturation that turned his eyes blue over the desert months was doing more than coloring tissue. It was integrating with the specific neurological and physiological baseline that the Bene Gesserit's training and breeding had established, working on a substrate that had been prepared to receive it in specific ways, opening the channels that the faculty travelled through with a specificity and a completeness that the same saturation in an unprepared person would not have achieved. The water of life was the concentrated version of this process, the same chemistry, the same fundamental interaction between melange and human neurochemistry, compressed into an intensity that the ongoing saturation could not have produced in any sustainable time frame, activating in a matter of days what might otherwise have taken years to activate. What the spice provided was not simply a chemical enhancement. It provided access to something that the human nervous system was apparently capable of perceiving but did not normally perceive. The specific information about probable futures that the prescient faculty processed. The question of how this was possible, how a neurochemical produced by a sandworm on a specific desert planet was capable of opening a human nervous system to information about the future, is not a question that Herbert's universe answers directly. The mechanism is present in the effect, but not explained at the level of the mechanism. What the spice did to Paul over the years and under the specific conditions of his life was give him something that no human being had ever had in quite the same form, a fully integrated, always-on perception of the probability space, accessible at the resolution of something approaching direct experience, available in real time as a navigational tool rather than as occasional insight. And then it gave him the trap. The same faculty at full development made the experience of ordinary human choosing increasingly difficult to maintain. The grooves in the probability space, the paths that the accumulated forces of history and genetics and political circumstance had worn toward specific outcomes, became increasingly hard to deviate from, not because deviation was impossible, but because the faculty that showed Paul what the grooves led toward also showed him what deviation led toward. And what deviation led toward was usually worse than what the grooves led toward, and the continuous awareness of this made choosing to deviate require not just the normal human willingness to take risks, but a willingness to actively choose worse outcomes in exchange for the subjective experience of genuine choice. Most people would have accepted the grooves. Most people, given the faculty Paul had, given the continuous visibility of the probability space that the spice had opened, would have navigated the well-worn paths and accepted the catastrophic but relatively predictable outcomes they led to, because those outcomes were at least certain enough to plan for, and the alternatives were worse, and the faculty was telling you this with something closer to certainty than anything else you had access to. Paul tried, consistently and imperfectly, to hold open the possibility of genuine choice in the specific context of a faculty that was continuously trying to close it. This attempt, sustained across the arc of his governance, was not successful in the sense of preventing the paths that the probability space showed most clearly. It was successful in the sense of maintaining, against the faculty's pressure, a quality of engagement with the present moment that allowed him to be more than the instrument of a forecast. He was a person navigating a trap that the trap kept showing him was a trap, using the tool of the trap itself to find the specific places where the trap's grip was weakest. This is an impractical way to live. It is also, possibly, the most honest way to live in the situation he was in. He did not pretend the trap wasn't there. He did not surrender to it. He held himself, imperfectly and at enormous cost, in the space between those two positions, and he governed from that space for 12 years, and when the space finally closed with Chani's death, he walked into the desert. The desert. In the end, everything in Paul's story leads back to the desert. Not Arrakis, the political unit, not the spice-producing planet, not the strategic asset, or the spiritual homeland, or the ecological wonder. The desert itself. The sand and the wind and the cold that arrives at night without moisture to soften it, and the worms moving through the substrate on their geological schedules, and the spice blows erupting across the erg with the specific violence of geological processes that human civilization had attached 10,000 years of meaning to, without changing anything fundamental about what they were. The desert did not know who Paul Atreides was. This is the most important fact about the relationship between Paul and the desert. The desert knew nothing about prophecy, and nothing about the Atreides tradition, and nothing about the Bene Gesserit's breeding program, and nothing about the Padishah Imperium, and nothing about the jihad that had spread in Paul's name across 61 billion deaths on hundreds of worlds. The desert was sand and wind and heat and the specific biology of the creatures that had made the sand what it was, and it applied the same standard to Paul that it applied to everything that had ever crossed it. Are you adapted or are you not? Paul was adapted. The desert years had made him adapted in the specific ways the desert required. The sandwalk was in his muscles. The stillsuit disciplines were in his habits. The worm riding was in his body's knowledge. The specific attentiveness that the desert demanded, the constant alertness to the signs that a worm was coming, the specific quality of presence that existing in a lethal environment on its own terms required, this was in him in the cellular way that only years inside a thing can deposit it. He was blind and walking in the open desert, and the Fremen tradition said this was the path for a man who could no longer meet the desert's requirements. But the desert itself, which had no interest in the Fremen tradition or any other human tradition, which simply was what it was and asked what it asked, the desert received him not as a man who had been emperor of the known universe, or a man who had led a holy war, or a man whose children were pre-born, and whose sister was becoming abomination, and whose prescient faculty was still running even as. He walked. The desert received him as a man walking in the sand. Whether he died in the desert, in the conventional sense, whether the biological processes that sustained him eventually ceased in the open erg, is not something the records confirm or deny. The Fremen said he was there, somewhere in the deep desert, and the Fremen were the people who knew the deep desert most completely. And their assertion that the desert had received him rather than simply killed him carries the specific weight of people who understood the difference between those two things. He walked in and was not found. The mythology built what it always builds in the absence of a body and the presence of an enormous need for meaning. A living saint, a prophet in the wilderness. The presence of Muad'Dib felt in the deep desert in the way that the faithful feel the presence of the things they cannot verify. This is what his life had been building toward from the moment the prophecy machinery of the Missionaria Protectiva had been activated in Jessica's conversation with Shadout Mapes, not because the mythology was wrong, exactly, or because it was simply a political confection. Because Paul had genuinely fulfilled something, had genuinely been the figure the desert had made him, had genuinely done what the situation required, even at the cost of what it cost. The faith that built around his disappearance was not founded on nothing. What it was founded on was a person, a specific person, born on a water world, educated by a duke who believed governance was a responsibility, and a mother who carried thousands of years of accumulated human wisdom in her ancestral memory, tested in a desert that had no use for credentials or mythology, shaped by 2 years of the hardest curriculum available. Given a faculty that exceeded any previous humans and a situation that exceeded the faculty's capacity, and governing for 12 years in the space between what he could do and what the situation required before walking into the sand at the end. The person made the mythology possible. The mythology made the person harder to see. Herbert's 6 novels are, among many other things, the sustained effort to see the person clearly, to hold the mythology and the person in view simultaneously without letting either dissolve into the other, to describe what it actually cost to be what Paul actually was, rather than what the legend required him to be. The desert received him. The rain still falls on Caladan, green mountains running with water that no one counts. The sand still moves across the erg on the winds that have been moving it since before any human foot left a print in it. The worms still make the spice that the universe needs and cannot replace and cannot fully understand. He was Paul Atreides. He was Muad'Dib. He was the Kwisatz Haderach and the Duke's son, and the desert's student and Charney's chosen, and the jihad's instrument, and the jihad's first critic, and the father of children who would have to carry the weight of what he had put in motion. He was a person in an impossible situation who tried, with the full extent of his capability, and with the principle his father had given him, to do the thing that was actually right rather than the thing that the mythology required. The desert is patient. It held him and holds him and will hold him until the sand has moved enough times that even the most persistent geologic memory of his having walked in it has been redistributed by the wind into forms that do not remember their origin. He was born on a world where it rained. He died, or did not die, in the place that had made him what he was, in the specific way that the desert receives the things it has made its own, completely, without remainder, in the ancient grammar of sand and wind that predates every human language for what it means to belong entirely to a place.